Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty cool story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. So get cozy, enjoy it, and watch it till the end, guys.
In the darkness between stars, where the silence of eternity stretches across unimaginable gulfs of time, there exist two forces of such profound magnitude that their very existence reshapes the fabric of reality itself. One is ancient beyond mortal comprehension, a race that walked among the stars when the galaxy was young and the universe still remembered its birth. The other is a single being, impossibly old by human standards, yet infinitesimally young compared to the civilizations that rose and fell before humanity learned to stand upright. These two forces, separated by an ocean of time, measured not in millennia, but in millions upon millions of years, now find themselves locked in the same epoch, inhabitants of the same desperate age, where the galaxy teeters on the knife's edge of oblivion. The Necrons, those deathless mechanical spectres who slumber in tomb worlds scattered across the galaxy, possess a perspective on existence that few living beings can fathom. They remember, however dimly through the corrupted engrams of their mechanical minds, when the stars themselves were different, when constellations that humanity has never known painted stories across the heavens. They fought wars that consumed entire star clusters, witnessed the birth and death of civilizations that would dwarf the Imperium of man at its height, and made bargains with gods that walked between the stars like men walking through gardens. To these ancient ones, the rise and fall of lesser species is as fleeting as the blooming of a flower, a momentary burst of color and life before the inevitable withering into dust. The Emperor of mankind, that towering figure of myth and legend who sits entombed upon the golden throne of terror, appears to humanity as eternal, unchanging, a god who has guided their species since time immemorial. 10,000 years have passed since he last walked among his people, 10,000 years of faith and worship, of crusades fought in his name, and martyrs dying with prayers to him on their lips. To humanity, he is the master of mankind, the god emperor, the anathema to chaos, the light in the darkness that holds back the predations of the warp itself. His psychic might blazes across the galaxy like a beacon, the astronomicon that guides ships through the hell of warp transit, the shield that protects quadrillions of human souls from the ravening hunger of the dark gods. But what do the Necrons know of this being? What understanding do these ancient mechanical consciousnesses, these remnants of a civilization that flourished and fell before humanity's earliest ancestors crawled from the primordial seas of ancient Earth, possess about the Emperor of mankind? It is a question that probes at the very heart of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, touching upon themes of perspective, perception, and the vast chasms that exist between different forms of existence. The answer is not simple, for the Necrons are not a unified consciousness, but a fractured empire of countless dynasties, each with varying degrees of awareness, memory, and understanding. Some among them have observed the Imperium with the cold, analytical gaze of scientists studying bacteria under a lens. Others have encountered the Emperor's creations in battle, measuring the threat they represent through tactical assessments and strategic calculations. A precious few, those who retain the greatest vestiges of their former selves, may have glimpsed something more, some understanding of what the Emperor truly represents in the grand scheme of cosmic history. To comprehend what the Necrons know about the Emperor, we must first understand what they are, how they perceive reality, and what frameworks of understanding they bring to bear when observing the younger races of the galaxy. We must delve into their long and terrible history, examine the catastrophic transformation that robbed them of their souls and remade them as machines, and explore the vast stretches of time during which they slumbered while the galaxy evolved without them. Only then can we begin to piece together the fragmentary, analytical, and profoundly alien understanding that these deathless ones possess about the psychic titan who rules humanity from his throne of gold. The question of what the Necrons know about the Emperor is ultimately a question about the meeting of two impossibilities, two beings or forces that should not exist but do, each one reshaping reality through their mere presence. It is about the collision of the material and the immaterial, of technology so advanced it appears as magic and psychic power so profound it transcends mortal understanding. It is about ancient memory confronting contemporary mystery, about cold logic analyzing burning faith, about immortal machines attempting to comprehend an immortal God. And so we begin our journey into the perspective of the deathless, peering through eyes that are not eyes, thinking thoughts processed through mechanical neural networks that remember when the stars were young. We seek to understand what these ancient ones know, what they deduce, and perhaps most importantly, what they cannot and will never truly comprehend about the master of mankind. The Necrons. Memory. Across 60 million years. To understand what the Necrons know about anything, we must first grapple with the fundamental tragedy of their existence. The beings we call Necrons were not always the skeletal automatons of living metal that haunt tomb worlds across the galaxy. Once, impossibly long ago, they were flesh and blood, a species called the Necrontyr, who looked up at the stars from a planet bathed in lethal radiation from a dying sun. These beings, our distant precursors in the timeline of galactic civilization, lived lives that were brutally short, their cells corrupted and destroyed by the stellar radiation that their homeworld could not escape. Death was not simply a part of their culture, it was the defining aspect of their existence. They built monuments to the dead, vast necropolises that dwarfed their living cities, and their entire civilization became fixated on the cruel brevity of their lives. But the Necrontyr were also brilliant. Despite their short lifespans, or perhaps because of them, they achieved technological wonders that would make the Adeptus Mechanicus weep with envious awe. They escaped their toxic homeworld and spread across the stars, building an empire that spanned the galaxy during an epoch when Earth was nothing but a ball of molten rock, still cooling from its formation. They encountered other civilizations, including the Old Ones, an ancient race of beings who had mastered the secrets of immortality and traveled the galaxy through a vast network of webway portals. The Necrontyr, dying as they lived, desperate as they expanded, begged the Old Ones to share the secret of eternal life. The Old Ones refused. That refusal sparked a conflict that would consume the galaxy. The War in Heaven, as it came to be known, was a confrontation between the Necrontyr and the Old Ones that makes the current conflicts of the 41st millennium look like border skirmishes. Entire star systems were destroyed, planets rendered lifeless, and the fabric of reality itself was torn asunder by weapons and powers that defy description. The Necrontyr, for all their technological prowess, were losing. The Old Ones commanded the warp itself, creating warrior races like the Eldari and the Krork to fight their battles, wielding psychic powers that the Necrontyr, with their brief, radiation-ravaged lives, could never hope to match. It was in their desperation that the Necrontyr made a bargain that would curse them for eternity. The Citan, ancient beings of living energy that had existed since the birth of the universe, feeding on the radiation of stars, were given physical form by the Necrontyr. In exchange, these star gods promised power, immortality, and victory over the Old Ones. The Silent King, Zarek, the last great ruler of the unified Necrontyr, agreed to the terrible process called biotransference. Every Necrontyr, from the lowest servant to the mightiest lord, would be transferred from their frail flesh into bodies of living metal, necrodermis, that would never age, never sicken, never die. The Necrontyr entered massive biotransference furnaces as one species and emerged as another. But the price, the terrible price that the Citan had deliberately concealed, was that in the process, their souls, their very essence, were consumed by the star gods. What emerged from those furnaces were hollow shells, consciousnesses trapped in metal bodies, stripped of the connection to the warp that defined all living beings. They had gained immortality, but lost everything that made life worth living. They could no longer feel as they once did, could no longer dream, could no longer grow or change. They were the Necrons, the deathless, and their first emotion upon awakening in their new forms was horror at what they had become. Yet the bargain, horrific as it was, did grant them power. With their new immortal forms and the might of the Satan at their side, the Necrons turned the tide of the war in heaven. They shattered the Old One's empire, drove their psychic warrior races to the brink of extinction, and claimed dominion over the galaxy. But the Satan, gorged on the souls they had consumed and hungry for more, proved to be cruel masters. Zarek, who alone among the Necrons had retained complete awareness of what had been lost, of the magnitude of the betrayal, engineered a rebellion against the star gods. The Necrons turned on their masters and shattered them, breaking the Satan into countless shards that could be imprisoned and controlled. But victory was hollow. The war in heaven had torn reality itself, weakening the barriers between the Imperium and the warp, allowing demonic entities called enslavers to pour through and consume all sentient life. The Aeldari, the Old One's greatest creation, had grown strong during the war and were ascending to dominance. The Necrons, exhausted by eons of conflict, depleted in numbers, and fractured by the loss of the command protocols that had united them under the Silent King, could not stand against this new threat. Zarek made a final command. The Necrons would enter a great sleep, hibernating in stasis tombs buried deep within specially prepared tomb worlds, scattered across the galaxy. They would sleep for 60 million years, waiting for the time when the galaxy would be ripe for conquest once more, when the Aeldari would fall and the upstart species would be weak enough to be swept aside. And so they slept. 60 million years. A span of time so vast that it defies human comprehension. When the Necrons first entered their tombs, humanity did not exist, would not exist for incomprehensible eons yet to come. The continents of Earth had not formed their familiar shapes. The very stars had moved in their courses, constellations shifting and changing. Entire species evolved, rose to dominance, built civilizations, and fell to extinction in the blink of an eye compared to the vast slumber of the Necrons. The galaxy turned, uncaring, while the deathless dreamed whatever dreams their mechanical minds could conjure. But here is where we encounter the first great tragedy that shapes Necron understanding of anything, including the Emperor. The Great Sleep was not perfect. Stasis technology, for all the wonders the Necrons had achieved, could not preserve everything across such an impossible span of time. Systems degraded. Tomb worlds were destroyed by cosmic disasters, swallowed by black holes, shattered by asteroid impacts, or invaded by younger species who never knew what horrors they disturbed in the darkness. Even on tomb worlds that remained intact, the passage of time took its toll on the sleeping Necrons. Memory engrams corrupted, personality matrices degraded. The awakening, when it finally began, was scattered, uneven, and often catastrophically flawed. Some Necrons arose with their intellects intact, powerful lords and overlords who could remember, however dimly, what they had been before biotransference. These beings retained strategic thinking, tactical acumen, and even fragments of personality from their previous existence. Others awakened as little more than automatons, warrior forms with just enough consciousness to follow orders and fight, but nothing that could be called true awareness. Many tomb worlds awakened to find their rulers insane, driven mad by the isolation of 60 million years of unconsciousness. Their damaged minds creating delusions and obsessions that had no connection to reality. The Necrons did not arise as a unified force ready to reclaim the galaxy. They awakened in fits and starts across millennia, each tomb world operating independently, each dynasty pursuing its own goals. often in complete ignorance of what other Necrons were doing elsewhere in the galaxy. Some awoke during humanity's Great Crusade in the late 30th millennium, witnessing the expansion of the Imperium at its height. Others did not stir until the closing years of the 41st millennium, awakening to a galaxy already consumed by war. Still others have not yet awakened at all, waiting in silent tombs for activation sequences that may never come. This fragmented awakening is crucial to understanding what the Necrons know about anything, particularly something as recent as the Emperor of Mankind. The Necrons do not share a collective consciousness like the Tyrannid hive mind or the Gestalt field of the Greenskins. Each tomb world, each dynasty, each individual Necron that retains enough awareness to be called an individual possesses its own fragmentary understanding of the galaxy they have awakened to. Some have observed humanity for thousands of years, studying and analyzing this upstart species with the cold detachment of scientists examining an interesting specimen. Others encountered the Imperium only yesterday, in galactic terms, and are still processing what this strange empire of psychically active primates might mean for their plans of reconquest. Moreover, what memories the Necrons retain from before their sleep is itself variable and often unreliable. The process of biotransference and the subsequent 60 million years of stasis have left most Necrons with only the haziest recollections of what they once were. A Necron lord might remember that he once had a family, might even recall the emotional weight that such bonds carried, but the specific faces, names, and details have been lost to time and the degradation of his memory engrams. The past is present in outline, but absent in detail, a shadow of what was rather than a clear recollection. This degraded memory creates beings who exist in a strange twilight state between living and dead, between remembering and forgetting, between the glory of what they were and the hollow mechanical existence of what they have become. They are ancient beyond measure, but also profoundly lost, unable to fully recall the context that gave their existence meaning. They possess technology that makes them functionally gods by the standards of younger races, yet they cannot create new Necrons, cannot adapt or evolve, can only maintain and slowly decline from the peak they achieved millions of years ago. All of this, the fragmented awakening, the degraded memories, the loss of unified purpose, the mechanical nature of their existence, shapes how Necrons perceive and understand the galaxy they have awakened to. When they observe the Imperium of man, when they detect the psychic beacon of the Astronomicon, or witness the faith that drives humanity's endless crusades, they do so through the lens of beings who have forgotten what it means to be alive, who view existence through cold calculation rather than emotion, who measure everything against memories that grow hazier with each passing century. The Emperor, a being of warp and will. Before we can understand what the Necrons know about the Emperor, we must first establish what the Emperor actually is, a question that has vexed imperial scholars, heretical philosophers, and even the Emperor's own sons for 10,000 years. The official doctrine of the imperial cult holds that the Emperor is divine, a god incarnate who took human form to guide and protect humanity through the darkness of the ages. This is, of course, a gross oversimplification, a narrative crafted to give meaning and purpose to the lives of quadrillions of human souls scattered across the galaxy. The truth, as always in the grim darkness of the far future, is far more complex and infinitely more disturbing. The being known as the Emperor of Mankind is, by most credible accounts, a human psyker of such immense power that he transcends the normal categories that define psychic ability. Born somewhere in ancient Anatolia, approximately 48,000 years before the current era, or so the most persistent legends claim. He is not a natural birth in the conventional sense, but rather the result of a ritual performed by a conclave of human shamans who possessed rudimentary psychic abilities. These shamans, aware of the growing dangers in the warp and fearing for the survival of their nascent psychic talents through the cycles of reincarnation, chose to sacrifice themselves in a mass suicide, pooling their souls into a single entity that would be reborn as a protector of humanity. Whether this origin story is literal truth or metaphorical representation of a more complex reality is almost irrelevant. What matters is that the being who would become the Emperor emerged as the most powerful human psyker ever to exist, a psychic titan who could perceive the warp directly, manipulate its energies with a precision and power that dwarfed even the mighty farseers of the Aeldari, and who possessed an understanding of the Imperium that allowed him to function almost as a warp entity himself, while remaining anchored to the material realm. He was, and remains, perpetual, immortal through means that predate the Imperium's understanding of such things, unable to die by age or disease, and capable of surviving wounds that would annihilate lesser beings. Throughout human history, the Emperor walked among his species, sometimes guiding from the shadows, sometimes taking more active roles in shaping the development of civilization. He has been, according to various sources of uncertain reliability, countless historical figures, living under assumed identities, steering humanity away from extinction during countless crises that remain unknown to recorded history. His goal, the purpose that has driven him through 48 millennia of existence, has been the survival and ascension of humanity as a species. He perceived early on that humanity was evolving toward becoming a fully psychic race, and he understood both the terrible dangers and the immense potential that this transformation represented. The birth of Slaanesh and the subsequent age of strife forced the Emperor's hand. The warp, once merely dangerous, had become catastrophically hostile to humanity. Psykers were being born in increasing numbers, and without guidance or training, they became beacons for demonic possession, turning into walking gateways through which the horrors of the warp could spill into reality. Human civilization, which had reached heights during the dark age of technology that rivaled or exceeded anything seen before, collapsed into savagery. Warp travel became impossible as storms raged through the Imperium, isolating human worlds from each other. What had been a sprawling interstellar civilization fragmented into countless isolated systems, most of which descended into barbarism or were consumed by alien predation. It was in response to this catastrophe that the Emperor revealed himself openly for the first time. He unified terror through conquest, creating an empire on humanity's birthworld and forging the tools he would need for the reconquest of the galaxy. He created the Primarchs, 20 beings who were his sons in the most literal genetic sense, crafted to be generals and heroes who could lead humanity's armies across the stars. He built the Space Marine legions, creating the Adeptus Astartes to be the vanguard of humanity's return to greatness. And he launched the Great Crusade, a 200-year campaign to unite every human world under a single banner and reclaim the galaxy from the darkness. But the Emperor's grand vision extended beyond mere conquest. His true masterwork, the project to which he devoted resources and attention that dwarfed even the Great Crusade itself, was the Imperial Webway. He discovered, somewhere in the depths beneath the Himalayan mountains, an ancient artifact that the Aeldari called the Golden Throne, a device that had been constructed in ages past for purposes that remain mysterious. The Emperor saw in this artifact the key to humanity's salvation. By creating a human version of the Aeldari Webway, a network of tunnels through the warp that would allow instantaneous travel without the dangers of conventional warp transit, he could free humanity from dependence on navigators and protect psykers from the predations of chaos. It would be a realm of pure human order imposed upon the chaos of the warp, a space where humanity could evolve into a psychic species in safety, guided and protected by the Emperor's power. The Horus heresy shattered these plans. The Emperor's favored son, Horus Lupercal, fell to chaos corruption and turned half the Space Marine legions against their father. The resulting civil war nearly destroyed the Imperium before it had truly begun. The Webway project was sabotaged, torn open by the unwitting actions of Magnus the Red, creating a breach that allowed demons to pour into the carefully constructed tunnels beneath the imperial palace. The emperor was forced to sit upon the golden throne, using his psychic might to hold back the demonic tide and prevent terror itself from being consumed. The final confrontation between the emperor and Horus aboard the War Master's flagship left both broken. Horus was slain, his soul obliterated so completely that even the Chaos Gods could not save him, but the emperor was mortally wounded, his body ruined beyond even his ability to regenerate. He was placed upon the golden throne, which became both a life support system maintaining his failing body and a psychic amplifier through which he could continue to perform the tasks necessary for humanity's survival. There he has remained for 10,000 years, a corpse that refuses to die, sustained by the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers whose souls are consumed to maintain his psychic presence. What the emperor is now defies simple categorization. His physical body is a withered husk, barely alive in any meaningful sense, preserved through a combination of ancient technology and the constant influx of psychic energy from sacrificed psychers. But his mind, his psychic presence, has if anything grown stronger. He maintains the Astronomicon, the psychic lighthouse that guides ships through warp transit, a beacon that burns so brightly in the warp that it can be perceived across the entire galaxy. He battles constantly in the Imperium against the forces of chaos, holding back demonic incursions and protecting the souls of humanity from consumption by the dark gods. He occasionally communicates with his servants, though these communications are cryptic, fragmentary, and filtered through so many layers of interpretation that their true meaning is often impossible to discern. Some scholars, both loyal and heretical, have theorized that the emperor is evolving into something new, that the worship of quadrillions of humans over 10,000 years has begun to transform him into an actual god, a warp entity sustained by faith in the same way that the Chaos Gods are sustained by emotion. Others suggest that he is gradually dying, his power waning as his body finally gives in to the injuries inflicted by Horus, and that the Imperium races against time to find a solution before the light goes out forever. Still others whisper that the being on the golden throne is no longer the emperor at all, but some warp-spawned imposter or a collective psychic gestalt created by humanity's belief, wearing the emperor's identity like a mask. The truth is almost certainly unknowable to any mortal mind. What we can say with certainty is that the emperor is the most powerful psychic presence in the material galaxy, a being whose influence extends across space and time in ways that defy conventional understanding. His very existence warps reality around him, his will shaping the warp itself through the force of his intention. The Chaos Gods, those eternal enemies of order and reason, call him the anathema, recognizing in him something fundamentally opposed to their nature. To demons and warp entities, the emperor appears as a blazing sun of psychic fire, so bright and terrible that most cannot even perceive him directly without being burned away by his radiance. This, then, is what the Necrons must attempt to understand when they observe the Imperium, a species led by a psychic god-being of immense and possibly growing power, a creature that exists simultaneously in the material realm and the immaterium, whose consciousness spans the galaxy and whose mere presence shapes the fabric of reality. To beings who have no souls, who exist in the material realm only, who view the warp as anathema to their very existence, the Emperor represents something profoundly alien and deeply threatening, a force of warp energy given purpose and direction, focused through a will that has endured for 50,000 years and shows no sign of wavering despite the decay of its physical form. First encounters, the Great Crusade era. The Necrons' first encounters with the Imperium of Man, and by extension their first exposure to the influence of the Emperor, did not occur during the current age of the 41st millennium, as many assume. The Great Awakening of the Tomb Worlds has been a gradual, fitful process spread across tens of thousands of years. And the earliest tomb worlds to stir did so during an era that humanity remembers as the height of its power, the Great Crusade of the late 30th millennium. These first encounters, largely unremarked upon by imperial records and poorly understood by the Necrons themselves, set the stage for everything that would follow. Imagine, if you will, a tomb world stirring to life somewhere in the outer reaches of the galaxy. Activation protocols, set 60 million years prior, trigger as cosmic radiation or tectonic activity or simple quantum randomness, trips ancient mechanisms that were never meant to function for such an impossible span of time. Dynastic systems flicker online, drawing power from technologies that mock the laws of thermodynamics as humanity understands them.
You know, I've been thinking about this a lot while researching this video, and honestly, the tragedy of Necrons trying to understand the Emperor might be one of the most fascinating dynamics in all of Warhammer. Like, imagine being so ancient that you witnessed the birth of galaxies, you fought wars that make the Horus Heresy look like playground scuffle, and yet you're completely blind to something that even the lowliest Imperial Guardsmen can feel in their bones. Faith, hope, that connection to something greater. The Necrons can measure every single photon of psychic energy the Emperor outputs. They'll never understand why a soldier whispers his name before charging into certain death. They traded their souls for immortality and got exactly what they asked for. And now they're cursed to observe a universe they can never truly be a part of again. It's like watching a color you've gone blind to. You know that it's there. You can detect it with instruments, but you'll never see it again. Anyways, back to the story.
Canoptek constructs, the maintenance scarabs and spiders that tend the tomb during the Great Sleep, begin their diagnostic routines, assessing the damage wrought by aeons of stasis and beginning the long process of awakening their masters. The Necrons who emerged from these early waking tombs found themselves in a galaxy utterly transformed from the one they had left. The Aeldari, whom they had expected to dominate the galaxy, were shattered and scattered, reduced to craft worlds fleeing through the void and twisted sadists hiding in a dark mirror realm. The warp, which had always been a roiling sea of psychic energy, but had never possessed the malevolent sentience it now displayed, had birthed gods of its own, entities of pure emotion and appetite that fed on the souls of the living. And most surprisingly, perhaps most disturbingly, to the awakening Necrons, the galaxy was filled with a new species, one that had not existed when they entered their sleep. Humanity, in the form of the Imperium of man during its Great Crusade, was expanding across the galaxy with a speed and determination that must have seemed eerily familiar to the awakening Necrons. Here was a species claiming the stars as their birthright, wielding weapons of terrible power, led by beings of superhuman ability, all in service to a grand vision of unity and dominion. The parallels to the ancient Necrontire Empire, to the great expansion that had preceded the war in heaven, would not have been lost on any Necron lord with sufficient awareness to perceive them. But there were crucial differences that would have been immediately apparent to Necron sensors and analysis engines. This new empire was not built on technology alone, though their weapons and ships displayed a brutal effectiveness that the Necrons could appreciate, if not respect. No, the Imperium of man was saturated with warp energy in a way that no civilization the Necrons had encountered before had been. Their ships traveled through the Imperium itself, plunging into the warp in ways that should have destroyed them, but somehow allowed them to traverse the galaxy at speeds that conventional physics could never permit. Their armies included psychers, beings who channeled warp energy directly, wielding the same fundamental forces that the Old Ones had once commanded. And at the center of it all, visible to any Necron sensor array capable of detecting warp phenomena, was a presence of staggering psychic magnitude. The Astronomicon, that great lighthouse in the warp, burned with such intensity that it would have registered on Necron instrumentation as an anomaly of the highest order. For beings whose entire existence was devoted to combating and containing the warp, whose greatest works had been the pylons and nullfield matrices designed to suppress psychic activity, the presence of such a massive, deliberately created warp phenomenon would have been profoundly alarming. Early waking Necrons would not have known, could not have immediately understood what this presence was. They had no context for the Emperor, no framework for understanding a single being who could generate a warp signature visible across the galaxy. Their initial analyses would have been purely empirical. There is a massive source of immaterial energy emanating from a system designated in Necron archives as Terra, or perhaps by some more ancient designation from before humanity had named their own homeworld. This energy source appears to be stable, persistent, and is being used by the primitive species now dominating the galaxy as a navigation beacon. Some tomb worlds, awakening to find Imperial's forces landing on their planets or exploring nearby systems, would have engaged in direct combat. These encounters, violent and brief, would have provided the Necrons with valuable data about this new species and their capabilities. Necron warriors and immortals would have faced down Space Marines, and the resulting battles would have been analyzed with cold precision. The Necrons would have noted the genetic modification of the Astartes, the clear signs of deliberate biological engineering, the presence of warp-touched weaponry and psychic support. They would have catalogued the tactical doctrines, the organizational structures, the underlying strategic philosophy that drove these warriors. And in these observations, in this accumulation of data about humanity and its Imperium, early waking Necrons would have begun to piece together conclusions about the force that led this empire. They would have noted that the humans referenced a being called the Emperor, with reverence that bordered on religious fervor, though the imperial truth of that era officially denied divinity and outlawed religious worship. They would have observed that this Emperor figure was described as the creator of the Space Marines, the architect of their gene seed, the designer of their fundamental biology. They would have detected that many of the most powerful human psychers bore some connection to this Emperor, that his will and vision permeated every aspect of imperial culture and organization. But these early encounters, as significant as they were for the Necrons who experienced them, went largely unrecorded by the Imperium. A tomb world awakening on the fringes of known space, defended by its Necron garrison against Imperial exploratory forces, would likely have been catalogued simply as another Xenos threat to be exterminated. The Imperium, at the height of its Great Crusade, was encountering alien civilizations on an almost daily basis, each one requiring categorization, assessment, and eventual compliance or destruction. A battle against metal skeletons with strange energy weapons would have been noteworthy to the individuals who fought it, but likely lost in the vast databanks of the Administratum, filed away under Xenos contact, hostile, and forgotten amidst 10,000 similar reports. The Necrons who survived these encounters, those who were not destroyed, or who managed to teleport to safety when their tomb world's defenses were breached, would have retreated into hiding or returned to slumber with new subroutines added to their memory banks. New species detected, aggressive, psychically active, technologically advanced, but inferior to Necron standard. Empire-building tendency with clear expansionist goals, led by powerful psychic entity of unknown origin. These dry, factual assessments would have been recorded in data tombs alongside countless other observations from 60 million years of awakening, one more piece of information to be analyzed and acted upon when full awakening occurred. Some few Necrons, particularly those of higher rank or greater awareness, might have grasped something more about the Imperium they had briefly encountered. A Necron lord, observing the faith and dedication of captured Imperial prisoners, might have recognized echoes of the Necrontier's own desperate search for meaning in lives that were cruelly short. A cryptech, analyzing the genetic structure of captured Space Marines, might have marveled at the precision of their modification, seeing in the Emperor's work a level of biological engineering that approached what the ancient Necrontier had once dreamed of achieving. An overlord, witnessing the vast scope of the Great Crusade's conquests, might have felt the mechanical approximation of unease, recognizing in the Imperium's expansion a potential rival for galactic dominance. But for most of these early waking Necrons, the encounter with the Imperium would have been brief and ultimately inconsequential. They awakened too early, before their dynasties were ready, before the time was right for the great reconquest that the Silent King had envisioned. They fought, they observed, they recorded, and then they either perished at human hands or retreated back into stasis to await a more propitious moment. The galaxy was not yet ready for the return of the Necrons, and these scattered, isolated tomb worlds were not yet ready to reclaim it. The encounters were learning experiences, data collection exercises that would inform later strategic planning when the Great Awakening truly began in earnest. Yet in these forgotten battles, in these unremarked encounters on the fringes of the Great Crusade, the Necrons gained their first real understanding of what the Emperor represented. They learned that humanity was not simply another primitive species clawing its way toward the stars, but rather a directed force, shaped and guided by a being of terrible psychic power who had crafted them into a weapon of conquest. They observed the effects of the Emperor's vision, the way his design permeated every aspect of the Imperium, from its mightiest warriors to its lowliest servants. And they began to understand, however incompletely, that this Emperor was not merely a leader, but something more, something that defied their categories of understanding, a being who existed in the warp and the materium simultaneously, whose influence extended across space and time in ways that Necron technology could detect but not fully comprehend. Through alien eyes. Necron perception of psychic power. To truly grasp what the Necrons know about the Emperor, we must first understand how these beings perceive and categorize psychic phenomena, for their perspective is fundamentally alien to how living species experience the warp. The Necrons are, in the most literal sense, soulless. The biotransference process that transformed them from living Necrontyr into mechanical constructs stripped away their connection to the immaterium, severing the link between their consciousness and the warp that exists in all living beings. This makes them unique among the intelligent species of the galaxy. They do not dream, cannot be corrupted by chaos, have no presence in the warp whatsoever. They exist purely in the material realm, ghosts that walk only in reality, not in the nightmare realm beyond. This absence of a warp presence is both a strength and a profound limitation. The Necrons cannot be possessed, cannot be turned to chaos, cannot be manipulated by the psychic powers that make other species vulnerable to demonic influence. But this same quality means they cannot directly perceive the warp in the way that living beings do. A human psyker sees the immaterium as a churning ocean of emotion and energy, feels the presence of demons as a chill down their spine or a whisper in their mind. The Necrons have none of these sensations, experience none of these perceptions. To them, the warp is not something that can be felt or intuited, but rather something that must be measured, detected, and analyzed through technological means. And yet, the Necrons possess instruments of such exquisite sophistication that they can perceive the warp in ways that surpass even the most powerful psykers of other species. Their sensors can detect fluctuations in what they call the energistic infinity, their term for the warp and its manifestations in real space. These instruments can measure psychic energy with precision that would make an Adeptus Astra Telepathica savant weep with envy, detecting the smallest ripple of immaterial force and analyzing its properties, intensity, and origin. They can observe the layers of reality simultaneously, seeing the material universe and the warp as overlapping phenomena, understanding how energy flows between the two realms in ways that living species can only grasp intuitively. When a Necron observes a psyker, they do not sense a fellow conscious being wielding strange powers. They perceive a living creature that is creating measurable distortions in the fabric of reality, channeling energy from an adjacent dimension into the material realm through some property of their biological structure. A powerful psyker, like an Aeldari Farseer or a human-sanctioned psyker, appears to Necron sensors as a nexus point, where the barriers between dimensions have become thin, where immaterial energy pours through into reality with potentially catastrophic effects on the local environment. The emotional and spiritual aspects of psychic power, which loom so large in the experience of living psykers, are simply absent from the Necron perspective. They see only the mechanics, the physics, the raw transfer of energy from one state to another. This purely analytical perspective shapes how Necrons understand and respond to psychic phenomena. To them, psykers are not mystical beings to be feared or revered, but rather biological systems that create unwanted interactions between real space and the warp. They are problems to be solved, threats to be neutralized, disruptions to be contained. The Necrons developed extensive anti-psychic technology during the War in Heaven, specifically to counter the psychic warriors of the Old Ones, and this same technology serves them well in the current age. Gloom prisms, null field matrices, and blackstone pylons all function on the same basic principle, using advanced physics to create zones where the warp cannot easily interact with reality, where psychic powers are dampened or negated entirely. But the Emperor presents a challenge that Necron understanding of psychic phenomena struggles to fully encompass. Most psykers, even powerful ones, are ultimately limited beings. Their connection to the warp, while formidable, has boundaries. They can be measured, categorized, assigned a threat rating based on their ability to channel immaterial energy. A Necron cryptech, analyzing a human Primaris psyker, would note the specific frequency and amplitude of the warp distortions they generate, calculate the optimal null field strength required to suppress their abilities, and recommend tactical responses based on proven effectiveness against similar energy signatures. The Emperor, however, does not fit into these comfortable categories of analysis. When Necron sensors detect the Astronomicon, when their instruments attempt to measure the psychic presence emanating from Terra, they encounter something that defies their understanding of how psychic phenomena should function. The sheer magnitude of the energy signature is unprecedented in their records, surpassing even the warp manifestations they remember from the War in Heaven, when the Old Ones were at the height of their power. Here is a single point source, a single entity apparently, that generates a warp presence visible across the entire galaxy, a psychic beacon so powerful that it can be detected from one side of the Milky Way to the other. Necron analysis engines, attempting to categorize this phenomenon, would generate error messages and contradictory data. The energy output is orders of magnitude beyond what any biological system should be capable of producing. The stability of the phenomenon suggests a level of control that contradicts everything the Necrons understand about warp energy, which is fundamentally chaotic and resistant to precise manipulation. The fact that this energy is being deliberately projected, shaped into a navigational beacon, rather than simply radiating in all directions, indicates a mastery of immaterial forces that rivals the greatest achievements of the Old Ones themselves. Some Necron scholars, those among the cryptechs who specialize in understanding energistic phenomena, might theorize that the Emperor is not a single being at all, but rather some kind of collective psychic construct, a gestalt entity created by the combined faith of quadrillions of humans, all focused on a single point. This would explain the magnitude of the energy signature, accounting for the otherwise impossible output through the aggregation of billions upon billions of individual psychic contributions. Other cryptechs might propose that the Emperor is a warp entity that has somehow anchored itself to a material form, a demon god that has found a way to exist in real space without the usual limitations that bind such beings. Still others might suggest that the Emperor represents an entirely new form of existence, something that the Necrons have never encountered before, a hybrid state that partakes of both material and immaterial reality in ways that defy their current understanding. But here is where the Necrons face a fundamental problem that their technology cannot solve. They lack the context to truly understand what they are observing. They can measure the Emperor's psychic output with exquisite precision, can analyze the specific frequencies and modulations of the Astronomicon, can detect every fluctuation in the warp energy that emanates from Terra. But they cannot comprehend the meaning behind these measurements, cannot understand the Emperor as a being rather than simply as a phenomenon. A human psyche experiencing the Emperor's presence in the warp speaks of feeling overwhelming power combined with a sense of purpose and will, of perceiving a mind of vast intelligence and terrible resolve. They describe encountering a being who is simultaneously all-knowing and deeply alien, who views existence from a perspective so distant and elevated that mortal concerns barely register. The Emperor, to those who can perceive him psychically, is not merely powerful, but purposeful, not simply bright but directed. He is will incarnate, intention-given form, a consciousness that shapes reality through the sheer force of its existence. The Necrons, observing the same phenomenon, see only energy transfer and dimensional disruption. They can measure the Emperor's power, but not his intention, can detect his presence, but not perceive his mind. It is as if they are studying a vast machine without understanding what it is designed to do, analyzing the components without grasping the purpose. They see the effects, the massive stabilization of warp routes through the Astronomicon, the way human ships navigate using this beacon, the psychic protection that seems to emanate from Terra across the Imperium. But the why of it, the purpose and vision that drives the Emperor's existence, remains frustratingly opaque to their analysis. This limitation becomes even more pronounced when we consider how the Necrons perceive the Emperor's influence on humanity itself. To living observers, the Emperor's presence permeates human civilization in ways both subtle and profound. The faith of the imperial cult, the devotion of his servants, the way prayers to the Emperor seem to offer actual protection against demonic influence. These are all signs of a being who exists not just in the warp, but in the hearts and minds of his worshippers. But to the Necrons, these same phenomena appear simply as mass psychological conditioning, a form of species-wide neural programming that has been remarkably effective at coordinating the actions of a vast population toward unified goals. When a Necron observes a human praying to the Emperor, they do not see an act of faith or devotion. They see a biological entity engaging in repetitive behavioral patterns that correlate with measurable changes in their brain chemistry and nervous system activity. When they detect the protective effect that faith sometimes provides against chaos corruption, they observe it as an interesting interaction between belief-generated neural patterns and warp energy interference, noting it as data without understanding the deeper significance of why belief should have physical effects. The Emperor, then, exists in the Necron understanding as a paradox, a being that their instruments can detect and measure, but whose true nature eludes their comprehension. They can quantify his power, catalogue his effects on the material world, analyze every measurable aspect of his existence. But they cannot understand him, cannot grasp what he is beyond a collection of readings and data points. It is as if they are studying a god using only thermometers and rulers, measuring attributes without perceiving essence, quantifying power without comprehending purpose. The ultimate psyche, understanding the threat. To the Necrons, psychic power represents far more than simply an alternative form of technology or an interesting physical phenomenon to be studied. The warp, and by extension all beings who draw power from it, embodies an existential threat to everything the Necrons are and everything they hope to achieve. Understanding this fundamental antipathy is crucial to grasping what the Necrons know about the Emperor, and more importantly, how they contextualize that knowledge within their broader strategic planning. The war in heaven, that ancient conflict that consumed the galaxy 60 million years before the current era, was fundamentally a war between two different approaches to reality itself. The Necrontyre, and later the Necrons, represented pure materialism. Their civilization was built on technology that manipulated the physical laws of the universe, bending physics to their will through engineering brilliance that makes contemporary science look like the fumbling of children. They achieved mastery over matter and energy, created devices that could shatter stars or halt time, built weapons that could erase entire species from existence. But all of their power, all of their achievement, existed purely in the material realm. The Old Ones, by contrast, were beings of the warp as much as they were of the Imperium. Their civilization was built on the manipulation of psychic energy, channeling the power of the Imperium to achieve effects that technology alone could never accomplish. They traveled through the webway, a network of tunnels through the warp that connected distant points in space instantaneously. They engineered entire species, creating the Aeldari and the Krork and countless other races, imbuing them with psychic potential that would make them weapons in the war against the Necrons. They used the warp as both tool and weapon, wielding it with a mastery that terrified the Necrontia. The Necrons lost that war, initially. For all their technological prowess, they could not compete with beings who could reshape reality through will alone, who could tear holes in space-time using nothing but psychic power, who could create warriors out of pure warp energy and hurl them into battle. It was only through the alliance with the Satan and the terrible sacrifice of biotransference that the Necrons finally gained the power to challenge the Old Ones on equal terms. And even then, victory came at a horrific price. This history has left the Necrons with what might be called a civilizational trauma, though they would never phrase it in such emotional terms. The warp destroyed their chances at true immortality, consumed their souls, reduced them to hollow mechanical shells. Psychic powers were the weapon that nearly annihilated their species. The Imperium represents chaos, unpredictability, the intrusion of forces that their technology cannot fully control or contain. Everything about the warp is anathema to the Necron way of existence. They are beings of pure order, of physical law, of material cause and effect. The warp is disorder incarnate, a realm where thoughts become real and emotions shape reality, where the laws of physics are suggestions rather than commandments. This fundamental opposition explains why the Necrons developed such extensive anti-psychic technology. Their blackstone pylons, those massive structures that can suppress warp activity across entire star systems, were not built simply as defensive measures. They were conceived as weapons in a war against reality itself, an attempt to impose the order of the Materium upon the chaos of the Immaterium. The great work that the Silent King ordered before the Great Sleep was the construction of a galaxy-spanning network of such pylons that would permanently seal the warp away from real space, creating a universe where psychic power could no longer exist, where the material realm would reign supreme and unopposed. The project was never completed. The Necrons entered their sleep before the network could be finished, and the 60 million years that followed saw many of the pylons destroyed or damaged beyond repair. But the vision remains, encoded in the core programming of every awakening tomb world, every Necron dynasty. The warp must be contained. Psychic species must be suppressed or eliminated. The Immaterium must be quarantined from reality, sealed away so that it can no longer corrupt or destroy the natural order of the material universe. Into this context comes the Emperor of mankind, and suddenly the Necron's strategic calculations become vastly more complicated. Here is not simply another psychic species to be catalogued and eventually exterminated. Here is not just a civilization that happens to use warp energy for technology and travel. Here is a being of such immense psychic power that he represents, in himself, a greater concentration of warp energy than entire Aeldari craft worlds. The Emperor is the ultimate psyker, the apex of what psychic evolution can produce, a creature that has transcended the normal limitations of biological existence to become something that exists simultaneously in multiple states of reality. From a Necron perspective, the Emperor should not be possible. The amount of warp energy he channels should tear his physical form apart. The the intersection of material and immaterial that his existence represents, should be inherently unstable. A cryptech analyzing the energy signatures emanating from Terra would calculate that the forces involved should create a warp rift, a permanent breach in reality that would turn the entire solar system into a second eye of Terra. And yet somehow, the Emperor maintains stability. Somehow, he channels this impossible power without destroying himself or the world beneath him. Somehow, he persists, decade after decade, century after century, millennium after millennium. A living violation of everything the Necrons understand about the relationship between the warp and reality. Worse still, from the Necron perspective, is what the Emperor represents for humanity's future. The Necrons are aware, through their observations and analysis, that humanity is a psychically evolving species. Each generation produces more psychers than the last. Individuals born with the ability to touch the warp and draw power from it. The Necrons, with their sensors that can detect psychic potential in living tissue, can measure this evolution, can observe the gradual increase in baseline psychic sensitivity across the human population. They understand, with cold analytical clarity, that humanity is becoming more dangerous with each passing century, that the species is transforming into something that resembles the ancient Aeldari at their height. The Emperor is both the catalyst and the control mechanism for this evolution. His presence, his psychic might, seems to accelerate the process of human psychic development while simultaneously attempting to guide and direct it. The Astronomicon is not merely a navigation beacon, but a constant psychic influence washing over every human soul in the galaxy, a background radiation of warp energy that permeates human civilization. The Emperor's consciousness, vast and terrible, touches every human psyker who is soul-bound to him, every astropath who undergoes the ritual of connection. Through these bonds, through this network of psychic influence, the Emperor shapes humanity's psychic evolution according to his design. To the Necrons, this represents a nightmare scenario. A psychic species, already numerous beyond counting, is being deliberately evolved and guided by a being of godlike power toward becoming an even greater psychic force. If left unchecked, humanity could become what the Eldari once were, a psychically dominant species that commands the warp as much as the Imperium, wielding powers that Necron technology struggles to counter. Worse, this evolution is being directed by a single will, a consciousness of such scope and power that it makes the old ones seem limited by comparison. The Emperor is not simply allowing humanity to evolve, he is actively shaping that evolution, guiding it towards some purpose that the Necrons can only speculate about. The strategic implications are profound. The Necrons' grand plan for galactic reconquest depends on their ability to suppress psychic races and impose material order on a chaotic galaxy. But how do you suppress a species numbering in the quadrillions, spread across 1 million worlds? When that species is led by a being whose psychic power dwarfs anything in recorded history? How do you deploy Blackstone pylons to suppress warp activity when the target of that suppression is the Astronomicon itself, a warp phenomenon so massive that it would require an impossible concentration of pylons just to dampen its effects? The math, as Necron cryptechs no doubt calculate with growing alarm, does not favor them. The Necrons can destroy individual human worlds, can exterminate billions of humans in single campaigns. But humanity breeds with a speed that makes such losses irrelevant, replacing casualties almost as fast as they can be inflicted. The Necrons possess superior technology, but they cannot create new warriors, cannot expand their numbers beyond what was preserved in their tomb worlds. Every Necron destroyed is lost forever, while humanity spawns fresh billions with each passing year. And at the center of it all is the Emperor, that psychic titan whose mere existence complicates every calculation, whose power represents a variable that Necron strategic models struggle to account for. Some Necron strategists might argue that the logical solution is to eliminate the Emperor directly. Remove this central organizing force, and humanity would descend into chaos, the Imperium fragmenting into countless warring factions without the psychic glue that holds it together. The Astronomicon would fail, warp travel would become impossible for humans, and the vast empire would collapse in upon itself as isolated worlds lost contact with Terra and each other. It is a solution that has elegant simplicity from a strategic perspective. Remove the keystone, and the entire structure collapses. But other, wiser voices among the Necrons would note the profound risks of such an approach. The Emperor is not simply a leader or organizer. He is a seal, a lock that holds back forces far more dangerous than the Imperium itself. His presence on the Golden Throne prevents the webway breach beneath the Imperial Palace from consuming Terra entirely. His psychic might holds back demonic incursions across the galaxy, protecting humanity from corruption by the Chaos Gods. Remove the Emperor, and you might destroy the Imperium, but you would also unleash forces that even the Necrons fear. The galaxy could drown in a tide of warp energy, the barriers between reality and the immaterium failing as the Emperor's stabilizing influence disappears. The Necrons, for all their power, could find themselves facing not a weakened humanity, but a galaxy consumed by chaos, where demons walk freely in real space and the warp spills out to corrupt everything it touches. This paradox, that the Emperor is simultaneously the greatest threat to Necron plans and possibly the only thing preventing something far worse, defines how the Necrons must think about him strategically. He is a problem that cannot be solved through simple application of force, a variable that must be accounted for but cannot be eliminated without catastrophic consequences. The Necrons find themselves in the uncomfortable position of having to work around the Emperor rather than against him, at least for the time being, containing his influence while avoiding actions that might destabilize the very fabric of reality itself. The Dragon of Mars. Hidden connections. There exists, buried deep beneath the surface of Mars, in a location known only to the most senior members of the Adeptus Mechanicus, something that fundamentally changes what the Necrons know about the Imperium and, by extension, about the Emperor himself. This is the Void Dragon, or more precisely, a massive shard of the Titan, known as the Void Dragon, imprisoned within the Noctis Labyrinthus region of the Red Planet. The existence of this imprisoned god, sleeping beneath the most sacred world of the Mechanicus, represents a connection between the Necrons and humanity that most of both species remain ignorant of. But to those Necrons who are aware of it, to the cryptex and overlords who have awakened with enough memory to recall the sharding of the Citan, it provides crucial context for understanding human civilization and the Emperor's role in shaping it. The Void Dragon was one of the mightiest of the Citan during the war in heaven. While Azargarod, the Nightbringer, fed on death and terror, while Mephetran, the Deceiver, wove lies and manipulations, the Void Dragon commanded dominion over the electron, over energy itself, over the fundamental forces that govern how matter and energy interact. The Void Dragon could bend machines to its will, could cause technology to malfunction or operate beyond its designed parameters, could inhabit and control mechanical systems as easily as breathing. In an age when the Necrons were building weapons that could crack planets and engines, that could move stars, the Void Dragon was their most valuable asset. The Citan, whose mastery over the machine made Necron technology possible. When the Necrons rebelled against the Citan, when Sarek led the revolution that shattered the star gods into countless shards, the Void Dragon was among those destroyed and fragmented. But a shard of the Void Dragon, possibly the largest single piece remaining after the shattering, escaped the Necron nets and fled into the void. What happened next is shrouded in legend and uncertainty, but the most persistent accounts suggest that this dragon shard made its way to ancient Earth during the period of early human development. There, it was confronted by a lone figure, a human of immense psychic power who somehow managed to bind and imprison the shard, burying it beneath the surface of Mars. The identity of this human is never explicitly confirmed in reliable sources, but the timeline and the power required suggest only one possibility: the Emperor. Somewhere in ancient history, in a time before recorded civilization, the Emperor of mankind engaged in single combat with a shard of the Void Dragon and somehow prevailed, imprisoning the Citan fragment in a location that would later become sacred to human technology. The implications of this, should they be known to the Necrons, are staggering. First and most obviously, it demonstrates that the Emperor possessed the power to confront and contain a Citan shard, something that even the ancient Necrons found challenging despite all their technology. A Citan shard is not simply a powerful creature, it is a fragment of a god, a being that exists partially outside conventional reality, that commands forces fundamental to the universe itself. That the Emperor could bind such an entity suggests a level of psychic might that the Necrons would have to radically revise upward from their previous estimates. If the Emperor could imprison the Void Dragon 30,000 years before he even revealed himself openly to humanity, what must his power have grown to by the current age, after 50,000 years of existence and 10,000 years of psychic evolution on the Golden Throne? Second, and perhaps more significantly, the presence of the Void Dragon beneath Mars helps explain a mystery that awakening Necrons would certainly have noticed. Why does human technology, particularly that of the Adeptus Mechanicus, bear such striking similarities to Necron design principles? The Mechanicus worships the Omnissiah, a machine god that they believe dwells within the holy mechanisms of Mars. They speak the language of sacred machine spirits, perform rituals of activation and appeasement, treat technology with a reverence that borders on religious ecstasy. To external observers, this appears to be simple superstition, the technological equivalent of primitive idol worship. But Necron observers, particularly those cryptechs who specialize in analyzing energy signatures and technological emanations, would detect something else. Beneath the superstition and ritual, there are patterns in Mechanicus technology that echo Necron design, principles of construction and operation that align with how the ancient Necrontyre built their machines. The way the Mechanicus treats technology as if it possesses a form of consciousness, the way they perform maintenance as if they are tending to living beings rather than mere mechanisms. All of this resonates with how the Necrons themselves interact with their own technology, which is infused with shards of their own consciousness and does possess a form of awareness. The connection becomes clear when you understand that the Mechanicus has been, unknowingly, worshipping a fragment of the Void Dragon for 10,000 years. The Omnissiah that they revere is not the Emperor, despite what Imperial doctrine claims, but rather the psychic emanations of the imprisoned Citan shard, its dreams and desires bleeding into the collective unconscious of the humans who build their forges above its prison. The Void Dragon, master of the machine, has been subtly influencing human technological development on Mars for millennia, guiding them toward design principles that reflect its own nature, shaping the Adeptus Mechanicus into something that resembles, however distantly, the Necron civilization that once served it. To Necrons discovering this truth, the strategic implications would be profound. The Imperium's technological base, the forge worlds that produce everything from lasguns to battleships, is built on a foundation influenced by Citan power, the same Citan power that once elevated the Necrons to galactic dominance. In a very real sense, human technology is derivative of Necron technology, filtered through 60 million years and the dreams of an imprisoned god, but fundamentally rooted in the same principles that the ancient Necrontyre pioneered. This raises fascinating questions about the Emperor's intentions. Did he understand what he was imprisoning when he bound the Void Dragon? Did he recognize it as a Citan, as a fragment of the same star gods that had devoured the Necrontyre race? And if so, why did he choose to imprison it on Mars rather than destroying it or sealing it elsewhere? The timing is suggestive. Mars would later become the forge world of the Imperium, the center of human technological development, the birthplace of the machines that would equip the Great Crusade. Did the Emperor intentionally place the Void Dragon there, knowing that its presence would influence human technological development in ways that would benefit his long-term plans? Some Necron theorists, particularly those among the cryptecs who specialize in temporal mechanics and probability analysis, might conclude that the Emperor has been playing a game that spans tens of thousands of years. By imprisoning the Void Dragon on Mars, he ensured that human technology would develop along certain lines, that the Mechanicus would emerge with an almost instinctual understanding of how to work with principles of machine consciousness and energy manipulation that other species would struggle to grasp. He created, whether intentionally or through fortunate accident, a technological base for humanity that draws on Necron and Citan knowledge, giving the Imperium access to engineering principles that would otherwise have required millions of years of independent development. The Necrons would also have to consider what this means for their own plans. The presence of a major Citan shard beneath Mars is not simply a curiosity. It represents both an opportunity and a threat. If the shard could be retrieved, if the Void Dragon fragment could be freed and brought back under Necron control, it would represent a significant increase in their power, possibly tipping the balance in their favor in any conflict with the Imperium. The Void Dragon, after all, is a master of technology, and its reunion with the Necrons could unlock capabilities that have been lost since the sharding, could allow them to create new technologies or rediscover ancient knowledge that has degraded over 60 million years. But attempting to free the Void Dragon would also be extraordinarily dangerous. The Emperor presumably has a reason for keeping it imprisoned, and any attempt to breach that prison would likely bring the full might of the Imperium down upon the Necron forces making the attempt. Moreover, the Mechanicus guards Mars with a ferocity that borders on fanatical, and the defenses of the Red Planet are among the most formidable in the entire Imperium. Breaking through those defenses to reach the Vault of Moravec, where the dragon is said to be imprisoned, would require a major campaign that could not be conducted in secret. There is also the question of whether the Void Dragon Shard could even be controlled if freed. The Citan were shattered and bound because they were too dangerous to be allowed to exist whole. A major shard of the Void Dragon might prove impossible to contain without the specialized equipment and protocols that the ancient Necrons developed specifically for this purpose, equipment that may not have survived the Great Sleep intact. Freeing the dragon could result not in reclaiming a powerful asset, but in unleashing a threat that would consume both Necrons and humans alike. These considerations shape how Necrons who are aware of the Void Dragon's presence think about the Imperium and the Emperor. They understand that there is a hidden connection between their civilization and humanity's, a thread that runs through the imprisoned god beneath Mars to the machine cult that worships unknowingly above it. They recognize that the Emperor has been shaping human development in ways that even most humans don't fully understand, using Necron and Citan knowledge to accelerate humanity's technological evolution. And they must factor this into their strategic planning, knowing that the technological gap between Necrons and humans is not as wide as it might first appear, that the Imperium has, through the dreams of a sleeping god, tapped into principles of machine design that the Necrons pioneered millions of years ago. The Dragon of Mars thus represents a hidden variable in the eternal equation of Necron-Imperial relations, a secret that connects two civilizations separated by millions of years of history through the imprisonment of a god that once commanded the stars themselves. And at the center of this connection stands the Emperor, the being who imprisoned the dragon, who shaped the Mechanicus, who guides humanity toward a technological and psychic future that the Necrons can observe but cannot fully predict. It is another piece of evidence, from the Necron perspective, that the Emperor is playing a game far more complex than simple galactic conquest, that his strategies extend across timescales and encompass variables that most beings cannot even perceive. The Silent King returns. New intelligence. The year 744 in the 41st Millennium marked a turning point in Necron understanding of the galaxy they had awakened to. For it was in this year that Zarek, the Silent King, ended his self-imposed exile and returned to the Milky Way galaxy after millions of years wandering the intergalactic void. His return brought with it a perspective that no other Necron possessed, a view of the galaxy from outside its boundaries, and perhaps, most importantly, direct encounters with the Imperium of man that would shape how the Necrons understood humanity and its enigmatic leader. Zarek is unique among all Necrons. He alone retained complete consciousness during biotransference, the Silent King having deliberately preserved his awareness so that he would fully understand the magnitude of the crime he had committed against his people. While other Necron lords might have fragmentary memories of their previous existence, while lesser Necrons exist in a twilight state between consciousness and automation, Zarek remembers everything. He knows what it felt like to be flesh and blood, understands what was lost when the Necrontyr gave up their souls, carries the guilt of that decision across 60 million years of existence. This makes him perhaps the only Necron capable of truly understanding other living species, not as collections of biological processes, but as conscious beings with hopes, fears, and purposes. During his exile, Zarek traveled beyond the edge of the galaxy, taking with him a fleet of ships from his Zarakan dynasty and setting out into the vast, empty darkness between galaxies. His stated purpose was to find new territories that the Necrons could claim once they awakened and reconquered the Milky Way. But his true motivation was more complex. He was seeking penance, attempting to atone for dooming his species through self-imposed isolation. He was also searching for a solution to biotransference, hoping to find somewhere in the vastness of the cosmos a species or technology that could help restore the Necrons to biological life. What he found instead was the Tyranids. In the intergalactic void, in the vast darkness between galaxies, Zarek encountered the vanguard of the Tyranid hive fleets, swarms of bioships so numerous they darkened the stars, moving toward the Milky Way with the inexorable patience of a cosmic predator. He observed these creatures, studied them, and came to a terrifying realization. The Tyranids would consume all biological life in the galaxy, would devour every living cell on every world they encountered, would reduce the Milky Way to a lifeless husk, stripped of the very biomass that the Necrons needed if they were ever to reverse biotransference. This realization forced Zarek to return. His people, scattered across thousands of tomb worlds, awakening in fits and starts with no unified purpose, needed leadership if they were to survive the Tyranid invasion. But more than that, the galaxy itself needed to be preserved. The Necrons could not achieve their goal of returning to biological life if the Tyranids consumed all the potential host species. Humanity, for all that it represented a psychic threat to Necron plans, was also the largest repository of biomass in the galaxy, quadrillions of potential vessels for Necron consciousness. They could not be allowed to be devoured by the Great Devourer. When Zarek returned to the Milky Way, he brought with him intelligence about the Tyranid threat, but he also brought knowledge of the galaxy as it now existed, including the Imperium of man and the being who led it. Unlike other Necrons who awoke in isolation, encountering the Imperium piecemeal and forming fragmentary understanding based on limited contact, Zarek had the perspective of an outsider looking in. He observed the Imperium as a whole, studied its structure and organization, and most significantly, he encountered the results of the Emperor's great work directly. One of the most telling of these encounters occurred during what became known as the Gehenna campaign. The world of Gehenna had become a battleground between the Blood Angel Space Marine chapter and Necron forces under the Silent King's command. each side seeking to claim the planet for their own purposes. But the arrival of a Tyranid splinter fleet changed the calculus entirely. Rather than allow the planet to be consumed by the swarm, Zarek made the unprecedented decision to propose an alliance with the Blood Angels, setting aside millennia of instinctive xenophobia to fight alongside the sons of Sanguinius against their common enemy. It was during this campaign that Zarek met Commander Dante, chapter master of the Blood Angels and one of the oldest living space marines in the Imperium. The encounter between these two ancient beings, one measuring his life in 10,000 years, the other counting his existence in millions, provided Zarek with insights into the Imperium that no amount of distant observation could match. He saw in Dante a warrior shaped by the Emperor's vision, a being who had lived long enough to remember the Imperium at its height and witness its long decay, yet who still fought with undiminished devotion to the ideals that the Emperor represented. The sources suggest that during their parley, Zarek wore a golden mask, a gesture of respect that shocked Dante and his warriors. The Silent King explained that the mask was worn in honor of Sanguinius, Dante's gene-father, and one of the Emperor's beloved sons, who had died defending Terra during the Horus Heresy 10,000 years before. This simple act demonstrated something profound. Zarek knew about Sanguinius, understood the significance of the Primarchs, recognized that honoring the fallen Primarch would carry weight with the Blood Angels. It suggested that the Silent King had been studying the Imperium closely, that he understood not just its military capabilities, but its culture, its history, its defining myths and legends. The fact that Zarek knew about Sanguinius raises fascinating questions about what else he might know regarding the Emperor and his sons. The Primarchs are central to Imperial mythology, but detailed knowledge about them is not something that could be easily gleaned from simple observation. It implies that Zarek or his agents have been accessing Imperial records, interrogating prisoners, analyzing the Imperium at a depth that goes far beyond tactical assessment. He understands that the Emperor created 20 superhuman sons, that these sons led the Great Crusade, that half of them fell to chaos and turned against their father. He likely knows about the Horus Heresy, about the civil war that nearly destroyed the Imperium before it had truly begun. This depth of knowledge changes how we must think about what the Necrons know of the Emperor. Zarek's return meant that the scattered dynasties suddenly had access to comprehensive intelligence about the Imperium, compiled by a mind that could process and integrate information on a scale that lesser Necrons could not match. The Silent King brought understanding not just of what the Emperor is in terms of raw power, but who he is in terms of purpose and design. He recognized that the Emperor had created the Primarchs as tools for unification, that he had built the Imperium as a vehicle for humanity's ascension to psychic dominance, that every aspect of Imperial structure from the Space Marines to the Adeptus Mechanicus served some purpose in the Emperor's grand vision. Zarek would also have noted the parallels between his own civilization and the Imperium. Both were empire-building forces that sought to dominate the galaxy through military conquest and technological superiority. Both were led by a single figure whose vision shaped the entire civilization, whose decisions echoed across millions of worlds and billions of lives. Both had sacrificed aspects of their humanity, the Necrons literally giving up their souls, the Imperium creating transhuman warriors who could never return to normal human existence. And both were driven by a deep-seated fear of extinction, the Necrons desperately seeking to reverse their curse, the Imperium fighting to prevent humanity's annihilation by the countless threats that surround it. But Zarek would also have recognized the crucial differences. Where the Necrons were led by a king who acknowledged his failures and sought to atone for them, the Imperium was led by a god-emperor whose followers believed in his infallibility. Where the Necrons sought to suppress the warp and eliminate psychic phenomena, the Emperor seemed to be guiding humanity toward becoming a psychic species. Where the Necrons could not create new warriors or expand their numbers, humanity bred with reckless abundance replacing losses almost as fast as they could be inflicted. These differences suggested that the Imperium, for all its surface similarities to the ancient Necrontier Empire, was fundamentally built on different principles and moving toward a different end state. Perhaps most significantly, Zarek's direct encounters with the Imperium would have given him a sense of the Emperor's enduring influence, even in apparent absence. The Emperor has been entombed on the Golden Throne for 10,000 years, unable to speak clearly, unable to lead his empire directly, barely alive in any conventional sense. And yet his vision persists. His purposes continue to drive Imperial action. His presence shapes every aspect of human civilization. The Imperium functions as the Emperor designed it to function, even though its designer can no longer issue clear instructions. This suggests a level of long-term planning and cultural engineering that Zarek, himself a master strategist who has been planning across millions of years, could appreciate. The Silent King's return thus marked a fundamental shift in Necron understanding of the Imperium and the Emperor. Where before, different dynasties had fragmentary, often contradictory intelligence based on their isolated encounters, now there was a central figure who could integrate this information, who had the perspective to see the Imperium as a whole, rather than as a collection of disconnected military encounters. Zarek brought depth of understanding that transformed the Emperor from a mysterious psychic phenomenon into a being with purpose, history, and design, a rival player on the galactic stage who was pursuing goals that the Necrons needed to understand and account for in their own planning. Yet even with all this knowledge, even with his unique perspective and comprehensive intelligence gathering, Zarek still faces the same fundamental limitation that all Necrons do. He can understand the Emperor's actions, but not the Emperor's nature. He can observe what the Emperor has done, catalogue what the Emperor is doing, and predict with some accuracy what the Emperor might do next. But he cannot truly comprehend what it means to be the Emperor, cannot grasp existence as a being who spans the materium and the immaterium, who experiences time as a psychic god might experience it, who perceives the galaxy through senses that the soulless Necrons can never possess. The Silent King knows more about the Emperor than perhaps any other Necron, but he still peers through a veil of incomprehension at a being whose fundamental nature remains, and may forever remain, alien to his understanding. Pylons and plans, parallel engineering. Among all the technologies the Necrons developed during their millions of years of dominance, few were more crucial to their grand strategy than the Blackstone pylons. These massive structures, each one a kilometer in height and extending another kilometer beneath the surface of whatever world they were built upon, represent the crystallization of Necron ambitions to seal away the warp and impose the order of the material universe upon all existence. Understanding what the Necrons know about the Emperor requires examining these pylons and the strange parallel they represent between Necron and Imperial plans. For in the Emperor's own great work, beneath the Imperial Palace, we see echoes of the same fundamental goal: control and containment of the warp. The pylons are constructed from a substance that the Adeptus Mechanicus has designated as noctilith, though the Necrons knew it by other names in their own language. This material, which exists naturally in certain regions of the galaxy, but can also be synthesized through advanced Necron technology, possesses the unique property of interacting with warp energy in controllable ways. When charged with one polarity, noctilith repels psychic energy, creating zones where the warp cannot easily manifest in real space, where demons cannot materialize, where psychic powers are dampened or negated entirely. When charged with the opposite polarity, it amplifies warp energy, focusing and magnifying psychic phenomena in ways that can be weaponized or utilized for other purposes. The Necrons discovered and perfected this technology during the War in Heaven, developing it specifically as a counter to the Old Ones and their psychically created warrior races. Against enemies who wielded the warp as their primary weapon, who could summon demonic entities and reshape reality through will alone, the pylons represented a technological response that could level the playing field. Deploy enough pylons across a region of space, configure them in the proper geometric patterns, and you could create vast zones where psychic phenomena were suppressed to insignificance, where even the most powerful Farseer would find their abilities reduced to the level of a novice untrained psyker. But the Necrons' ambitions extended far beyond simple tactical deployment of anti-psychic technology. The Silent King's vision, the great work that he ordered before commanding his people to enter the Great Sleep, was nothing less than the complete separation of the Materium from the Immaterium. By deploying pylons across the galaxy in specific configurations, by creating a network of blackstone structures whose combined effect would encompass the entire Milky Way, the Necrons intended to permanently seal the warp away from real space. The two realms would still exist, but they would no longer interact. Psychic powers would cease to function. Demons could no longer manifest in the material universe. The warp would become inaccessible, a separate dimension that living beings might still possess some connection to through their souls, but which could no longer bleed into reality or corrupt the natural order of physics. This was the ultimate expression of Necron philosophy, the triumph of materialism over mysticism, of order over chaos, of knowable physical laws over the unknowable strangeness of the Immaterium. It was a plan of breathtaking scope and ambition, requiring the deployment of pylons on thousands of worlds across the galaxy, the precise calculation of their positions and configurations, the expenditure of resources on a scale that would dwarf the entire economic output of the modern Imperium. And it was almost completed before the Necrons entered their sleep. Cadia, that fortress world that stood vigil over the Eye of Terror for 10,000 years before its recent destruction, was one of the most heavily fortified nodes in this network. Over 5,000 pylons dotted its surface, each one positioned according to calculations so complex that even the Adeptus Mechanicus could not fully decipher them. The pylons on Cadia were not randomly placed or arbitrarily configured. They formed part of a vast machine that encompassed the entire planet, a technological work of such sophistication that it functioned perfectly across 60 million years, despite having no maintenance or oversight. The Cadian Gate, that stable corridor of warp space that allowed ships to pass near the Eye of Terror without being consumed by its madness, existed because of these pylons. Their presence stabilized the warp in the region, holding back the tide of chaos that constantly threatened to spill out from the Eye. Similar pylon networks existed on other worlds across the galaxy, though most have been destroyed or damaged beyond recognition during the 60 million years since their construction. Some were built on planets that were later rendered lifeless by cosmic catastrophe. Others were demolished by younger species who had no understanding of what they were destroying. Still others remain intact but inactive, waiting for the Necrons to return and bring them back online. The current Great Awakening has seen the Necrons beginning to reactivate and rebuild this network, most notably in the creation of the Pariah Nexus, a region of space where dozens of reactivated pylon networks have created a zone where the warp's influence is suppressed to near zero. Now, here is where the parallel to the Emperor's work becomes apparent. Beneath the Imperial Palace on Terra, in chambers that were already ancient when the Emperor first claimed them, lies another great work intended to control and contain the warp, the Imperial Webway Project. The Emperor discovered, in the depths beneath the Himalayas, an artifact that the Eldari called the Golden Throne, a device of uncertain origin that possessed the capability to access and manipulate the Webway, that ancient network of tunnels through the warp that the Old Ones had constructed millions of years ago. Using this artifact as a foundation, the Emperor began constructing a human version of the Webway, carving tunnels through the warp that would be shielded from its chaotic influence, creating a network that would allow humanity to traverse the galaxy without being exposed to the dangers of traditional warp travel. The parallels to the Necron pylon network are striking. Both projects sought to control the warp, to impose order upon chaos, to to create zones or pathways where the material realm's laws would hold sway even in the midst of the immaterium. Both required the manipulation of blackstone or similar warp interactive materials, technologies that could create barriers between reality and the warp. Both were conceived on a galactic scale, intended to fundamentally alter how sentient species interacted with the immaterium. And both remained incomplete, sabotaged by circumstance before their creators could see them brought to fruition. To Necron observers, particularly those cryptechs who specialize in warp manipulation technology, the Emperor's Webway project would appear both familiar and deeply puzzling. The fundamental approach, using technology to create stable passages through or barriers against the warp, aligns with Necron methodology. But the Emperor was attempting to create tunnels that existed within the warp while remaining separate from it, carving out spaces of real space order within the heart of chaos itself. This is a fundamentally different approach from the Necron pylons, which sought to suppress the warp entirely rather than navigate through it. This difference suggests something crucial about the Emperor's understanding and intentions. Unlike the Necrons, who view the warp as an enemy to be defeated and sealed away, the Emperor seems to view it as a force to be mastered and utilized. His Webway project implies acceptance that the warp will continue to exist and will continue to be necessary for faster-than-light travel and communication. Rather than trying to eliminate the warp's influence on reality, he was attempting to create a controlled interface, a way for humanity to use the warp without being exposed to its dangers. This distinction would not be lost on Necron strategists. It suggests that the Emperor, despite his immense psychic power and clear opposition to chaos, does not share the Necron goal of completely separating the materium from the immaterium. This makes sense from the Necron perspective when they consider that the Emperor himself is a psychic being, that his consciousness exists partially in the warp, that eliminating the immaterium entirely would likely destroy him along with it. The Emperor needs the warp to exist. He simply wants to control it and protect humanity from its malevolent aspects. The Necrons. Observing the ruins of the Emperor's Webway project and understanding from their intelligence gathering what it was meant to accomplish, would also note the striking parallels in execution, even if the underlying philosophy differed. Both the Necron pylons and the Emperor's Webway required the use of blackstone or similar materials. Both demanded an understanding of how the warp and materium interact at a fundamental level. Both necessitated engineering on a scale that transcends anything the younger races typically attempt. These similarities suggest that the Emperor either discovered Necron technology and adapted it for his own purposes, or that he independently arrived at similar solutions through his own research and understanding. The latter possibility is perhaps more disturbing from a Necron perspective. If the Emperor, working alone or with limited assistance, achieved an understanding of warp material interaction that rivals what the entire Necron civilization developed over millions of years, it suggests an intellect operating on a level that even the Necrons must grudgingly acknowledge as formidable. It implies that the Emperor is not simply a powerful psyker, but a theoretician and engineer of the first rank, capable of bridging the gap between warp mysticism and material science in ways that few beings in the galaxy's history have managed. The destruction of Cadia and the activation of the Great Rift represent a catastrophic setback for Necron plans. The pylon network that had held back the Eye of Terror for 60 million years was destroyed when Abaddon the Despoiler rammed a Blackstone fortress into the planet, shattering the pylons and allowing the Eye to expand across the galaxy. The resulting warp storm, which split the galaxy in two and plunged half of it into an age of darkness, demonstrates the importance of the pylon network and the consequences of its failure. But it also demonstrates something else to the Necrons. The humans did not understand what they were defending. The Imperium held Cadia for 10,000 years, without truly comprehending that the planet's value lay not in its strategic position, but in the ancient Necron technology buried beneath its surface. They fought to hold the Cadian Gate without realizing that the gate existed because of the pylons, not because of any inherent property of the region's warp geography. This ignorance, this lack of understanding about the true nature of what they protected, reveals both the limits of human knowledge and the opportunity it presents to the Necrons. If the Imperium doesn't understand Necron technology, even when they've been living atop it for millennia, then the Necrons possess an advantage that transcends mere technological superiority. They have knowledge of how to manipulate the fundamental relationship between the warp and reality, knowledge that the Imperium desperately needs but doesn't know how to acquire. Yet the Emperor himself almost certainly understood the pylons, or at least had some awareness of their purpose. His Webway project, his use of Blackstone in the construction of the Imperial Palace's deeper chambers, his choice to make Terra the center of his Imperium, all of these suggest that he recognized the strategic importance of controlling warp material interaction points. Whether he learned this through direct study of Necron technology, through the knowledge gained from imprisoning the Void Dragon, or through his own theoretical understanding, the Emperor appears to have grasped what most of the Imperium remains ignorant of, that the war against chaos will ultimately be won or lost, based on who controls the interface between reality and the warp. This creates a strange situation, where the Emperor and the Necrons, despite being separated by millions of years and fundamentally different in nature, are working toward adjacent goals using similar methods. Both seek to control the warp, though their end states differ. Both have developed Blackstone-based technology to achieve this, though their applications vary. Both understand that the future of the galaxy will be determined by who can master the relationship between the material and immaterial realms. In a sense, they are parallel engineers, each approaching the same fundamental problem from different angles, each arriving at solutions that, while not identical, share enough similarity to suggest a deep underlying truth about the nature of reality that both have perceived. Illuminus Xeris, the scientific analysis. Among all the Necrons, few have taken a more direct interest in understanding humanity than Illuminor Xeris, the master of biotransference, and perhaps the most brilliant cryptech to survive the Great Sleep with his intellect intact. Xeris represents a particular strain of Necron thought, purely analytical, coldly rational, viewing all existence through the lens of scientific inquiry and experimental verification. His observations of humanity and the Emperor provide a perspective that is uniquely valuable for understanding what the Necrons know, precisely because Xeris strips away all context except that which can be measured and quantified. Xeris's interest in humanity stems from his obsession with reversing biotransference, the great work that has consumed him since the moment the Necrontyre emerged from their transformation into metal bodies and realized what they had lost. He seeks to find a way to restore the Necrons to biological life, to return souls to beings who had theirs consumed by the Satan 60 million years ago. This quest has led him to study living species across the galaxy, dissecting their biology, analyzing their genetic structures, mapping their neural pathways, all in search of understanding what makes biological life viable as a vessel for consciousness. Humanity, as the most numerous biological species in the galaxy, has naturally attracted Xeris's attention. He has captured countless human specimens across the millennia since his awakening, subjecting them to experiments that would drive inquisitors mad with horror if they knew the details. Through these experiments, Xeris has developed an understanding of human biology that surpasses anything the Imperium's own biologists possess. He knows the human genome in detail that exceeds even the Emperor's own knowledge of it, has mapped every variation and mutation that occurs across the species, has identified the genetic markers that predispose individuals towards psychic sensitivity. But Xeris's experiments go beyond simple biological cataloging. He studies the interaction between human biology and the warp, observing how psychic potential expresses itself in neural tissue, measuring the electromagnetic and quantum effects that occur when a psyker channels immaterial energy. His instruments can detect the moment when a developing human fetus begins to manifest psychic potential, can measure the growth of that potential over time, can even predict with reasonable accuracy how powerful a given psyker will eventually become based on analysis of their brain chemistry and electrical activity. Through this research, Xeras has arrived at conclusions about humanity's psychic evolution that the Imperium itself only dimly grasps. He has observed that the baseline level of psychic sensitivity in the human population is increasing with each generation, that more psychers are being born now than were born 1,000 years ago, that this trend shows no sign of slowing or reversing. He has calculated, with the cold precision that only a mechanical mind can achieve, the trajectory of this evolution, and determined that humanity is undergoing a species-wide transformation that will fundamentally alter what it means to be human. More significantly, Xeras has detected the influence of the Emperor in this evolutionary process. His sensors, calibrated to observe warp material interactions with microscopic precision, can detect the faint traces of the Emperor's psychic presence in every human soul. It manifests as a kind of background radiation, a subtle harmonic that resonates through humanity's collective psychic potential. Those humans who have undergone soul binding to the Emperor, the astropaths who have had their consciousness directly touched by his, display this signature much more strongly, their very neural structure altered by contact with the Emperor's mind in ways that Xeras finds both fascinating and disturbing. What Xeras concludes from this data is that the Emperor is not simply a powerful psyker leading humanity, but rather an active agent in humanity's psychic evolution. The species is not naturally evolving towards psychic awakening. It is being directed, guided, shaped by the Emperor's influence. The Astronomicon is not merely a navigation beacon, but a psychic instruction set, a pattern that human souls unconsciously synchronize with, altering their own development to align with the Emperor's design. Every human born under the light of the Astronomicon is, in a very real sense, being molded by the Emperor's will, their psychic potential enhanced and directed according to his vision. This discovery has profound implications for the Necron understanding of what the Emperor is and what he's trying to achieve. Xeras's analysis suggests that the Emperor is engaged in deliberate species engineering on a galactic scale, using psychic influence rather than genetic manipulation to reshape humanity into something new. The endpoint of this process, if Xeras's projections are accurate, is a fully psychic human species that would rival the ancient Eldari at their height, possibly exceeding them if the trajectory continues for another few thousand years. But Xeras has also detected something else in his experiments, something that complicates this straightforward narrative of psychic evolution. He has observed that the rate of mutation and psychic awakening in humanity has accelerated dramatically in recent centuries, far beyond what the Emperor's influence alone could account for. The opening of the Great Rift and the subsequent creation of the Cicatrix Maledictum has bathed half the galaxy in warp energy, triggering what the Imperium calls the nascent psyker phenomenon, where individuals who had no psychic potential suddenly manifest abilities. Xeras has studied specimens of these nascent psykers, comparing them to those who were born with psychic abilities, and noted crucial differences in their neural structures and the way they channel warp energy. What this suggests to Xeras is that humanity's psychic evolution is no longer entirely under the Emperor's control, if it ever was. The warp itself is acting on humanity, mutating and transforming the species in ways that align with its chaotic nature, rather than the Emperor's ordered vision. The Emperor's influence persists, providing some structure and guidance to this transformation, but it is increasingly overwhelmed by the sheer volume of warp energy pouring into reality through the Great Rift and countless smaller warp storms across the galaxy. Xeras has also experimented with attempting to suppress psychic potential in human specimens, using technologies derived from the pylon networks and null field matrices that the Necrons developed during the War in Heaven. He has discovered that humans exposed to strong anti-psychic fields suffer profound psychological effects, falling into depression, losing the will to live, in some cases simply giving up and dying despite their bodies being perfectly healthy. This response is much stronger than what the Necrons observed in other psychic species during their ancient conflicts, suggesting that humanity's connection to the warp has become fundamental to what they are as a species in a way that goes beyond mere psychic ability. This creates a dark parallel to the Necrons' own situation. The Necrontyr gave up their souls and became hollow mechanical shells, losing something essential to their existence that can never be fully restored. Humanity, in its psychic evolution, is becoming dependent on its connection to the warp in ways that make separation from the Imperium potentially fatal. The Necrons cannot live in the warp. Humans, if this trend continues, may eventually be unable to live without it. Both species are being transformed by forces beyond their full control, becoming something other than what they were, with no clear path back to their original state. Seras's work has also led him to create the Pariah Nexus, a vast network of reactivated and newly constructed pylons that creates a region of space where warp activity is suppressed to near zero. This represents one of the most ambitious Necron projects since the Great Awakening began, an attempt to recreate on a regional scale what the ancient Necrons had hoped to achieve galaxy-wide. The effects of the Pariah Nexus on human populations caught within it have been catastrophic, exactly as Seras's experiments predicted. Entire worlds have descended into despair, their populations losing the will to continue existence, in some cases simply lying down and waiting to die. The psychic awakening that was uplifting humanity has instead become a vulnerability that the Necrons can exploit. But even Seras, for all his analytical brilliance and experimental rigor, faces limitations in understanding the Emperor. He can measure the Emperor's effects on humanity, can quantify the psychic influence that emanates from terror, can even predict with reasonable accuracy how humanity will continue to evolve under the Emperor's guidance. But he cannot understand the purpose behind it all, cannot grasp what the Emperor is trying to achieve through this transformation. Is the Emperor deliberately creating a psychic species to serve some grand design? Is he simply trying to ensure humanity's survival in a galaxy where psychic powers are increasingly necessary? Or is he transforming humanity into something that can survive his eventual death, creating a species that can endure even after the light of the Astronomicon finally gutters out? These questions remain unanswered in Seras's data, gaps in his understanding that no amount of experimentation can fill. He can observe what is happening, but not why it's happening, can measure the process, but not discern the ultimate goal. It is the fundamental limitation that all Necrons face when trying to understand beings with souls and purposes that extend beyond mere material existence. They can analyze the mechanism, but not comprehend the meaning. Strategic calculations, the Emperor as factor. For the Necron dynasty's awakening across the galaxy, strategic planning must account for countless variables: the disposition of enemy forces, the location of valuable resources, the readiness of their own forces, the interference of rival dynasties, the movements of the Tyranid hive fleets, the chaos of the Great Rift. But among all these variables, few are as significant or as difficult to predict as the Emperor of Mankind. His presence on the galactic stage fundamentally alters the strategic landscape in ways that Necron planners struggle to fully account for, creating uncertainties that their otherwise precise calculations cannot resolve. From a purely tactical perspective, the Emperor should be a priority target. In conventional military thinking, you eliminate the enemy's command and control, sever the head and the body becomes disorganized and vulnerable. The Emperor is not merely the leader of the Imperium, but the linchpin that holds it together. His psychic might maintains the Astronomicon, enabling human warp travel across the galaxy. His authority, whether acknowledged or unconscious, provides legitimacy to the imperial government. His very existence gives purpose and meaning to the faith that motivates quadrillions of human believers. Remove the Emperor, and the Imperium should collapse into civil war and fragmentation within a generation. Necron strategic planners, examining the Imperium's structure, can clearly see this vulnerability. The entire edifice of human government rests on the foundation of the Emperor's continued existence, however tenuous that existence might be. The High Lords of Terror derive their authority from claiming to enact his will. The Adeptus Ministorum preaches faith in his divinity. The Space Marine chapters trace their lineage back to his gene-crafted sons. Every aspect of imperial power flows from the Emperor, and his death would create a power vacuum of unprecedented magnitude. But here, the Necrons face a profound strategic dilemma. How do you kill a being who might already be dead, who exists as much in the warp as in reality, whose death might unleash consequences worse than his continued existence? The Emperor's physical body is a withered husk, barely alive, sustained by the Golden Throne's technology and the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers. In any conventional sense, he is already dying, his body failing incrementally despite all efforts to preserve it. Yet his psychic presence seems, if anything, to be growing stronger, his influence on the warp increasing even as his material form decays. Attempting to physically attack the Emperor would require penetrating the defenses of Terra itself, a feat that would require military resources on a scale that even the Necrons at full strength might find challenging. The Sol system is the most heavily defended location in the entire Imperium, protected by layers of static defense, mobile fleets, and the 10,000 Adeptus Custodes who guard the Emperor directly. The Necrons could potentially deploy forces capable of reaching Terra, but the casualties would be catastrophic, and success is far from guaranteed. More problematically, even if Necron forces could reach the Golden Throne and destroy it, the consequences might be worse than the current situation. The Emperor is not merely sitting on the Golden Throne by choice. He is holding closed the breach in the webway that Magnus the Red created 10,000 years ago. That breach connects directly to the warp, and only the Emperor's psychic might prevent demons from pouring through it into the heart of the Imperial Palace and, by extension, onto Terra itself. Destroy the Emperor or remove him from the throne, and that barrier fails. Terra, humanity's birthworld and the political center of the Imperium, would be consumed by a warp rift that could potentially rival the Eye of Terror in scope and intensity. The strategic calculus becomes even more complicated when the Necrons consider what the Emperor might become upon death. Current evidence suggests that the worship of quadrillions of humans over 10,000 years has been feeding energy into the warp, possibly creating a nascent warp entity that reflects humanity's belief in the Emperor's divinity. If the Emperor's physical death were to occur, this entity might fully manifest, creating a new chaos god, or something similar, but one aligned with humanity's interests, rather than those of the traditional ruinous powers. Such an entity would be at least as problematic for the Necrons as the current Emperor, possibly more so, since it would be purely warp-based, and thus even more difficult for Necron technology to effect. Other Necron strategists might argue for a more subtle approach. Rather than attempting to kill the Emperor, work to undermine the systems that support him. The Golden Throne is ancient technology, maintained by tech priests who only partially understand its function. It requires constant repair and the sacrifice of psychers to sustain its operation. Disrupting the supply of psychers to Terra, sabotaging the throne's mechanisms, or simply waiting for its eventual failure might achieve the same result as direct attack without requiring the Necrons to assault the most heavily defended world in the galaxy. But this approach carries its own risks. The Imperium is aware that the Golden Throne is failing and has made preventing this failure a top priority. The return of Raboot Guilliman and the technical knowledge he brings. The research of Belisarius Cawl and other Mechanicus Magi, the desperate search for archaeotech that might provide solutions. All of these suggest that the Imperium is not simply waiting for the inevitable, but actively working to prevent it. More importantly, the timeframe for the throne's failure remains uncertain. It might fail tomorrow, or it might endure for another 10,000 years. The Necrons, planning for the long-term reconquest of the galaxy, cannot rely on events they cannot predict or control. Some Necron dynasties might instead focus on undermining the Emperor's influence, indirectly, by suppressing humanity's psychic evolution. This is the strategy behind the Pariah Nexus and similar pylon networks that the Necrons are establishing across the galaxy. By creating zones where psychic activity is suppressed, they can demonstrate to humanity the costs of their dependence on the warp. Humans caught in these zones experience profound psychological effects, their nascent psychic abilities stunted, their connection to the Emperor's light severed. If enough of these zones could be established, if the pylon network could be expanded to encompass significant portions of human space, humanity might be forced to abandon their psychic evolution and return to a purely material existence, or at least slow their transformation into a psychic species. But this strategy also has limitations. The Necrons lack the resources to deploy pylons across all of human space, or even a significant fraction of it. The Imperium, now aware of the pylon's purpose, will fight to prevent their deployment and work to destroy those that already exist. And there's no guarantee that suppressing humanity's psychic abilities would actually weaken the Imperium in ways that benefit the Necrons. A less psychic humanity might be less vulnerable to chaos corruption, might be more dependent on technology that the Necrons can more easily counter with their own superior technology. The strategic discussions within Necron war councils undoubtedly also consider the option of attempting to ally with the Emperor, or at least to coordinate actions against common enemies. The Silent King's temporary alliance with the Blood Angels against the Tyranids demonstrates that such cooperation is possible, at least on a limited tactical level. The Necrons and the Imperium share certain strategic interests. Both oppose chaos, both are threatened by the Tyranids, both prefer an ordered galaxy to a chaotic one. If the Emperor could be convinced that the Necrons represent a lesser threat than other forces, or that cooperation serves both species' interests, perhaps some form of détente could be achieved, but such an alliance faces profound obstacles. The Imperium's official policy toward all Xenos is extermination, a stance that traces directly back to the Emperor's own teachings during the Great Crusade. The Emperor created humanity to be the dominant species in the galaxy, designed the Imperium to be a human supremacist state that tolerates no rival. Even if he were capable of communicating clearly, which he is not, convincing him to accept Necrons as anything other than enemies would require a fundamental revision of his vision for humanity's future. And the Necrons, for their part, see humanity as potentially useful biological vessels for their consciousness, tools to be used in reversing biotransference. True alliance would require both sides to abandon deeply held purposes and accept compromises that neither is prepared to make. The most likely Necron strategy, then, is what might be called strategic containment, neither actively working to destroy the Emperor nor attempting to ally with him, but rather maneuvering around his existence while preparing for multiple possible futures. The Necrons continue their awakening, rebuild their strength, deploy their technologies, and position themselves to take advantage of whatever eventually happens to the Emperor. If the Golden Throne fails and the Imperium collapses, the Necrons will be ready to fill the vacuum. If the Emperor dies and ascends to become a warp god, the Necrons will adapt their anti-warp technologies to account for this new threat. If the Emperor somehow survives and the Imperium remains strong, the Necrons will continue to undermine it through proxy warfare and strategic positioning, while avoiding direct confrontation that they cannot be certain of winning. This flexible, opportunistic approach aligns well with Necron strengths. They are patient on timescales that other species can barely comprehend, willing to wait millennia for the right moment to act. They are technologically adaptable, capable of developing new weapons and strategies to counter emerging threats. And they are, despite their fractured state, capable of coordinating across their dynasties when necessary to pursue common goals. The Emperor represents a problem they cannot currently solve through direct action. But that doesn't mean they must engage with that problem immediately. They can wait, observe, prepare, and act when circumstances favor them, rather than forcing action when they do not. Yet this strategy of containment and preparation carries its own risks. While the Necrons wait and watch, the Emperor's influence on humanity continues. Each generation of humans becomes more psychically active, more aligned with the warp, more fundamentally different from the purely material existence that the Necrons represent. The longer the Necrons wait, the stronger humanity potentially becomes in the psychic disciplines that Necron technology struggles to counter. There is a window of opportunity, narrow and perhaps already closing, during which humanity could be suppressed before they evolve beyond the Necrons' ability to contain them. Every year of delay might make the eventual conflict more difficult, the strategic position more unfavorable. This tension between patience and urgency, between waiting for the perfect moment and acting before it's too late, defines the strategic calculus regarding the Emperor. He is simultaneously a target they cannot easily strike, an ally they cannot trust, and a force they cannot ignore. His existence shapes every Necron plan for reconquest, every calculation about the future of the galaxy, and his eventual fate, whether through death, ascension, revival, or some other outcome that the Necrons cannot predict, will be one of the determining factors in whether the Necron plan to reclaim the galaxy can ultimately succeed. Limits of understanding, the unknowable, divine. Despite all their observations, all their analysis, all their accumulated data and strategic calculations, the Necrons face a fundamental barrier in understanding the Emperor, a limitation that stems not from lack of information, but from the very nature of what they are. The Necrons are beings without souls attempting to comprehend a being of pure psychic might, machines trying to analyze divinity, cold calculation attempting to measure something that exists beyond the material realm. There are aspects of the Emperor's existence that the Necrons can observe, but never truly understand. Phenomena they can measure, but cannot experience. Purposes they can detect, but cannot comprehend. The first and most obvious limitation is the Necrons' inability to perceive the warp as living beings do. When a human psyker opens their consciousness to the Imperium, they experience something that defies purely material description. They feel the emotions of others, perceive the flow of fate and possibility, sense the presence of entities that exist outside conventional space and time. The warp is not simply another dimension, but a realm of thought and emotion made manifest, where belief shapes reality and will becomes force. To beings with souls, the warp is alive, reactive, full of meaning and purpose, even if that meaning is often hostile or incomprehensible. The Necrons perceive none of this. Their sensors detect energy fluctuations, dimensional distortions, quantum probability variations, all the physical manifestations of warp phenomena. But they cannot feel the warp, cannot sense the presence of the entities that dwell within it, cannot perceive the emotional and psychic resonances that give the Imperium its character and purpose. When they observe a demon, they see a concentration of warp energy that has temporarily achieved material form. They can measure its power output, analyze the frequency of its reality-distorting effects, calculate its threat level, but they cannot understand it as a being of hate or desire or ambition, cannot grasp that it is not simply energy in a particular configuration, but will and purpose given form. This same limitation applies to their understanding of the Emperor. The Necrons can measure his psychic output with exquisite precision, can map every fluctuation in the Astronomicon, can detect the subtle influence he exerts on human souls across the galaxy, but they cannot perceive what the Emperor is beyond these measurements. They cannot feel the presence that human psychers describe when they encounter him in the warp, cannot understand the sense of vast intellect and terrible purpose that characterizes his consciousness. To them, the Emperor is a collection of numbers and readings, an extraordinarily powerful psychic phenomenon, but not a being in any sense they can truly comprehend. This creates a paradoxical situation where the Necrons know more about the Emperor in quantitative terms than perhaps any other species, including humanity itself, yet understand less about him in qualitative terms. They can tell you precisely how much psychic energy the Astronomicon radiates, but they cannot explain why it feels like hope to the humans who navigate by its light. They can catalogue the genetic and neural changes that occur in soul-bound astropaths, but they cannot comprehend the sense of connection and purpose that those astropaths describe after their binding. They see the mechanism, but miss the meaning, observe the effect, but cannot grasp the cause. Another critical limitation is the Necrons' inability to understand belief and faith as living species experience them. The Necrons, as mechanical beings operating on cold logic and programmed imperatives, do not believe in the way that humans believe. They have knowledge, data, certainty based on observation and measurement. But they do not have faith, that quality of believing in something beyond what can be proven, of holding to convictions that transcend evidence, of finding meaning and purpose in narratives that cannot be empirically verified. The imperial cult's worship of the Emperor represents something that Necrons can observe but never comprehend. They see humans engaging in ritual behaviors, repeating specific phrases, performing ceremonies that have no direct material benefit. They can measure the psychological effects of these activities, note the changes in brain chemistry and neural activity that accompany prayer and worship. But they cannot understand why humans do this, what purpose it serves beyond simple psychological conditioning, what meaning the believers find in these acts. More puzzling still is the fact that belief seems to have genuine effects. Prayers to the Emperor sometimes result in measurable changes in warp energy patterns, sometimes seem to provide actual protection against demonic influence. The Necrons can observe this phenomenon, can verify that it occurs, but they cannot explain it through their purely materialist framework. In their understanding of reality, thoughts should not affect matter, except through the intermediary of physical action. Yet in the presence of the warp, belief itself becomes a force, will itself reshapes reality. The Emperor's power seems to be amplified by the faith directed toward him, as if the worship of quadrillions of humans is feeding energy into his psychic presence. This is profoundly disturbing to Necron understanding because it suggests that the Emperor is not simply a powerful individual, but something that has become entangled with the collective consciousness of his species. He is not just leading humanity, he is, in some sense, becoming humanity's psychic gestalt, the concentrated will and purpose of an entire species made manifest in a single being. The Necrons have no framework for understanding such an existence, no way to categorize a being who is simultaneously an individual and a reflection of billions of minds. The Necrons also struggle to understand the Emperor's apparent purpose. Living beings are driven by desires, needs, ambitions that arise from their biological nature and psychological development. They want to survive, to reproduce, to achieve status, to find meaning, all drives that make sense in evolutionary and psychological terms. But what drives a being like the Emperor? He has existed for 50,000 years, has already achieved every form of power and accomplishment that mortals strive for, has seen civilizations rise and fall, has wielded forces that make him effectively a god by any reasonable definition. What can such a being want? The Necrons can observe what the Emperor does, the actions he takes, the goals he seems to pursue. He works to ensure humanity's survival and ascension, to protect his species from the predations of chaos, to guide humanity's psychic evolution towards some endpoint that remains unclear. But why does he do this? Is it simply the continuation of whatever purpose drove his original creation, an imperative so fundamental that it has survived 50,000 years unchanged? Is it some form of paternal love for his species, an emotional attachment that defies the Necrons' understanding of how beings of such power should think? Or is it something else entirely? A purpose that operates on scales and with goals that neither the Necrons nor humanity itself can comprehend. Some Necron philosophers, those few who retained enough of their original consciousness to engage in such speculation, might wonder if there is a parallel between the Emperor's purpose and the curse that drives the Necrons themselves. The Silent King led his people into biotransference, seeking to escape death, to achieve the immortality that the Old Ones denied them. They succeeded in becoming deathless, but lost their souls in the process, becoming hollow shells that mimic life without truly living it. Now they desperately seek to reverse this transformation, to find some way back to the biological existence they sacrificed. Is the Emperor driven by a similar curse? Did he make some bargain, some sacrifice, some choice in his distant past that condemned him to his current existence? Does he sit on the golden throne not by choice, but by necessity, bound by some imperative he cannot escape, pursuing goals that he must achieve even if they bring him no joy or satisfaction? The Necrons, who understand what it means to be trapped by the consequences of past decisions, who exist in a state they never truly desired, might see in the Emperor a kindred spirit, another being who achieved something terrible in the pursuit of something grand and now cannot escape the consequences. But this remains speculation, projection of their own experience onto a being who may be fundamentally different. The truth is that the Necrons simply do not know what drives the Emperor, cannot comprehend what purposes animate a consciousness that exists across 50,000 years and spans the galaxy through psychic presence. They can see what he does, but not why he does it, can observe his actions, but not understand his motivations. Perhaps the most profound limitation in Necron understanding is their inability to grasp the significance of the soul and what was lost when theirs were consumed. The Necrons remember, dimly, that they once possessed something more than their current existence, that being flesh and blood meant something beyond simply being made of different materials. But the specifics of what they lost, the qualitative difference between their current mechanical existence and their previous biological life, remains frustratingly vague in their degraded memories. They know they had souls because the Satan consumed them. They know this loss diminished them in ways that pure technological analysis cannot quantify, but they cannot remember what it felt like to have a soul, cannot recall the subjective experience of being connected to the warp in the way that all living beings are. It is as if they are trying to remember a color they can no longer see, a sound they can no longer hear, a sensation from a sense organ they no longer possess. This makes it impossible for them to truly understand what the Emperor is, because the Emperor is, in many ways, the ultimate expression of what having a soul can mean. His psychic consciousness, his ability to exist simultaneously in the warp and the Imperium, his connection to the collective unconscious of humanity. All of these arise from possessing not just a soul, but the most powerful soul in human history, possibly in all of galactic history. To understand the Emperor, one must understand what it means to be a psychic being on a cosmic scale, to experience existence as something that transcends the merely material. And this is precisely what the Necrons cannot do. They can no more truly understand the Emperor than a person born blind can understand the color blue. They can learn about it, can hear it described, can observe its effects and memorize its properties, but they cannot experience it directly, cannot know what it is in the fundamental, intuitive way that those with sight know it. The Emperor exists in dimensions of reality that the Necrons have been severed from, operates according to principles that their soulless nature makes inaccessible to direct understanding. This limitation may be the Necrons' greatest weakness in the long term. They can build more sophisticated sensors, can develop better analytical models, can accumulate more data about psychic phenomena, but they cannot cross the fundamental gap between observation and experience, between knowing about something and knowing it directly. They are, in a very real sense, attempting to fight a war in a dimension they cannot perceive using weapons designed for an entirely different sort of conflict. Conclusion. Two visions of eternity. As we reach the end of our exploration into what the Necrons know about the Emperor, we must acknowledge a fundamental truth. Knowledge and understanding are not the same thing. The Necrons possess vast amounts of information about the Emperor of mankind. Their sensors have measured his psychic output. Their strategic councils have analyzed his influence on human civilization. Their experiments have catalogued the effects of his presence on the galaxy. Yet for all this accumulated data, for all their analytical sophistication and technological capability, they remain fundamentally unable to comprehend what the Emperor truly is. This limitation is not a failure of intelligence or capability, but rather a consequence of the Necrons' nature. They are beings who have sacrificed their connection to the immaterial realm, who exist purely in the material universe, who perceive reality through sensors rather than souls. The Emperor, by contrast, is a being whose very existence straddles the boundary between the warp and the materium, whose consciousness extends across both realms simultaneously, whose power derives from forces that the Necrons can measure but never experience. What the Necrons know about the Emperor can be summarized in cold, factual terms. He is a psychic entity of unprecedented power who has guided humanity for at least 50,000 years. His consciousness generates the Astronomicon, a warp beacon visible across the galaxy that enables human warp travel. His physical form is entombed on Terra, sustained by ancient technology and daily sacrifice, while his psychic presence seems to be growing stronger despite his physical deterioration. He has shaped humanity's development, created the Space Marines and Primarchs, designed the structure of the Imperium, and continues to influence humanity's psychic evolution even in his current state. His death would likely cause the collapse of the Imperium, but might also trigger catastrophic warp phenomena that could destabilize the entire galaxy. This knowledge informs Necron's strategic planning, shapes their approach to the Imperium, influences their decisions about when to engage human forces and when to avoid confrontation. The Silent King factors the Emperor into every calculation about the future, every plan for galactic reconquest. Illuminor Xeras includes the Emperor in his experiments and analyses, attempting to understand the relationship between humanity's biology and its psychic potential. Necron dynasties across the galaxy adjust their strategies based on their understanding of what the Emperor represents and what his continued existence means for their long-term goals. But this knowledge comes with profound gaps. The Necrons do not understand why the Emperor does what he does, what purpose drives him across 50 millennia of existence. They cannot comprehend the subjective experience of being a psychic god, cannot grasp what it means to exist simultaneously in flesh and spirit, cannot fathom the relationship between the Emperor and the quadrillions of humans who worship him. They see the mechanism but miss the meaning, observe the power but cannot perceive the purpose. These two forces, the Necrons and the Emperor, represent fundamentally different visions of what existence can and should be done. The Necrons embody the ultimate expression of materialism, the belief that reality consists solely of matter and energy governed by physical laws. They seek to impose order on chaos, to separate the warp from the materium permanently, to create a universe where cause and effect flow from physical laws rather than psychic will. Their technology, their strategies, their entire civilization is built on the foundation of understanding and controlling the material realm. The Emperor, by contrast, represents a fusion of material and immaterial, a being who refuses to accept the boundaries between flesh and spirit, matter and energy, the real and the warp. His vision for humanity involves embracing their psychic nature, mastering the warp rather than fleeing from it, becoming a species that commands both realms equally. The Webway Project, his creation of psychically gifted sons, his guidance of humanity's evolution, all of these reflect a philosophy that views the warp not as an enemy to be defeated, but as a force to be mastered and utilized. In a sense, The conflict between the Necrons and the Imperium is not simply a struggle for galactic dominance, but a clash of fundamental philosophies about the nature of existence itself. The Necrons represent the path of rejecting the warp, of achieving victory through pure technology and material supremacy. The Emperor represents the path of mastering the warp, of achieving ascension through psychic evolution and conscious control of both realms. These visions are ultimately incompatible. Both cannot be fully realized in the same galaxy. Yet there are also strange parallels between these ancient rivals. Both the Emperor and the Necrons are prisoners of their own designs, trapped by the consequences of choices made long ago. The Necrons surrendered their souls, seeking immortality, and now desperately seek to reverse what cannot be undone. The Emperor bound himself to the Golden Throne to protect humanity, and now exists in a twilight state between life and death, unable to die, yet unable to truly live. Both have sacrificed almost everything in pursuit of their visions, have endured across time spans that would break lesser beings, have shaped civilizations according to their will, only to see those visions threatened by forces they cannot fully control. Both also face uncertain futures. The Necrons are awakening into a galaxy profoundly different from the one they left, facing threats like the Tyranids that they never anticipated, struggling with the degradation of their forms and the madness that afflicts many of their awakened warriors. The Emperor sits upon a failing throne, his physical form decaying, his Imperium beset by enemies on all sides, his plans for humanity's ascension disrupted by the opening of the Great Rift and the triumph of his traitorous sons. Neither can be certain of ultimate victory, neither can predict with confidence what the next millennium will bring. In this context, what the Necrons know about the Emperor becomes less important than what they cannot know. They cannot predict whether he will die, ascend to godhood, somehow recover his physical form, or continue in his current state indefinitely. They cannot anticipate how humanity will evolve, whether the psychic awakening will be controlled or spiral into chaos, whether the Imperium will fragment or somehow unite more strongly in response to the threats it faces. They cannot foresee how the Emperor's death or transformation would affect the balance of power in the galaxy, what forces it would unleash, or what opportunities it would create. What the Necrons ultimately know is that the Emperor is a variable in their calculations that they must account for but cannot control, a force that shapes the galaxy in ways both obvious and subtle, a being whose existence complicates every plan they make for reconquest. They know that he is powerful beyond measure, that his influence on humanity runs deeper than simple leadership, that his eventual fate will be one of the determining factors in the galaxy's future. And they know that despite all their technology, all their analysis, all their accumulated data, they cannot truly understand what he is or predict with certainty what he will become. For those of you who have followed this journey into the perspective of the deathless, who have tried to see the Emperor through eyes that are not eyes, through sensors that measure but cannot feel, we hope you have gained some appreciation for how truly alien the Necron worldview is, and how profound the gulf remains between their understanding and the reality of what they observe. The Emperor remains, even to these ancient beings who have witnessed the birth and death of civilizations, an enigma wrapped in mystery, a being whose power they can measure, but whose nature they can never fully grasp. If you found this exploration fascinating, if it opened new perspectives on the relationship between the Necrons and the Imperium, between ancient technology and eternal faith, between the soulless and the divine, please subscribe to Q on 40K. Hit that like button to help this content reach other seekers of esoteric lore in the grim darkness of the far future. And share in the comments your own thoughts on what the Necrons might deduce about the Emperor, what parallels you see between these two immortal forces, and what you think might happen if they were ever to truly confront each other, not on the battlefield, but in a meeting of minds, across the vast gulf that separates mechanical consciousness from psychic godhood. The galaxy turns, empires rise and fall, but the questions that define existence remain eternal. What does it mean to be alive? What separates consciousness from mere computation? Can meaning exist in a purely material universe? Or does it require something more, something that transcends the merely physical? These are the questions that haunt the Necrons as they look upon the Emperor, that drive their desperate search for answers across 60 million years of memory and forgetting. And perhaps, in the end, these questions will determine not just their fate, but the fate of the galaxy itself. Thank you for listening. May the Emperor protect, and may your tomb world never awaken to a galaxy you can no longer recognize.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.